Ladies and gentlemen, it's never a good thing to have to stop good people having good conversation at lunch, but I guess it's not as bad as if it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? Then I'd really get into trouble. My name is Peter Bruce. I'm Dean of the Darla Moore School of Business, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to our 41st EOC. Now, 41 is a big number. Thanks to both Doug and Joey for doing this. I don't think you were here 40 years ago. Either of you, hopefully. Yeah, okay, well, Doug has just admitted to 35. We'll take that, Doug, and thank you for your incredible service. And Joey, yeah, I think that's worth a round of applause. It's always exciting for me to be here at this event because we have in this room a really incredibly good representation of business, of society, of academia, and indeed of our citizenry around South Carolina. We have at this particular conference over 200 people who have registered. We estimate that there are about 130 or so that are here physically, and there are another 60 or 70 that are viewing this event virtually. We have amongst us here CEOs, COOs, CIOs, SVPs, business owners, business unit leaders, professors, and a whole range of other titles. And I just want you to know that we so appreciate your support, and I hope that you find that you get really valuable information here so you will know what to do on Monday morning when you have your decisions to make, whether it's personal or business. I'd also like to thank SCRA for their sponsorship of this particular event, and I think a round of applause for that incredible institution is not a bad idea. And equally, I would like to thank Tina Poindexter, who's a member of my staff at the Moore School, for organizing the event, for the caterers that are here with us today, and yes, even for the people that are taking the TV pictures in the back. I notice they're not filming now, so I can say just about anything, right, and I should be okay. But thank you all for your support in this event. My last assignment is to introduce our speaker. Now, when I had a look at this, I could have started in so many ways. I could have started with ambassador. I could have talked about chief of staff. I could have talked about congressman. I could have talked about state representative. And any of those topics I could have begun. But Mr. Mulvaney, I thought that the best phrase to use is citizen of South Carolina. And I want to thank you, sir, for being here. Many of you know the Chief of Staff, which I think is kind of the latest and the most important, though ambassador, I don't know. You can play it either way. But he's been an amazing representative of our state, both here as well as in Washington, D.C. He is here to talk about a very interesting topic. I did a little bit of research over the weekend, and I urge all of you to try this. Go onto that well-known researcher, Google, and type in 2 words, inflation and money supply. See what comes up. You can forget the and. 2 words plus an and. See what comes up. And you will discover that the correlation between M2, the broad measure of money supply, and inflation is not very strong. And read that and see what that does. Then go in and type in budget deficit and inflation and see what comes up. And you will discover that there are opinions just about from one side to the other with regard to that. I'm very excited to hear your view of where we are on this one. I know that you come with an incredible amount of insider knowledge about what really happens in DC. Thank you for driving all the way down from Rock Hill. Citizen Mulvaney.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce. Thank you very much to the Moore School for having me. Thanks to the university. It's nice to be here. It's especially nice to be home and out of Washington, D.C. It's nice especially to be giving a speech live to real human beings, which I haven't done a lot of in the last couple of months. I know I'm supposed to start with a joke. I also know I'm no good at that, or at least I'm told that I'm no good at that. I'm also told that when you are the budget director, which was actually my favorite job in all the ones that I had, when you are the budget director, you're not supposed to have a sense of humor because it prevents you from doing your job well. My kids are the ones who actually tell me I don't have a very good sense of humor. I was at dinner one night when I have triplets, and they were about 7 or 8. They're 21 now. They're 7 or 8 at the time. And I said something that was really, really, really witty. It was a cross of Monty Python and Caddyshack, and it was really good stuff, and it was completely crickets at my dinner table. And my only daughter looks at my wife and says, "Mommy, is Daddy funny and we just don't get it?" And she said, "No, sweetie, your daddy's not funny. He just amuses himself." You can always count on your family to keep you honest. I was let's tell some folks beforehand, I was recently an answer on Jeopardy. Something about people whose names begin with same letters, and it was me and Mark Meadows, and I was the answer, and everybody texted me and told me how famous I was, and I shared that with my family, and my daughter once again reminded me that says I could not be famous since nobody knew the answer on Jeopardy. So I'm going to try and talk today a little bit about inflation. And I'm going to do so, by the way, in the introduction that I got online and in all the materials I received from the Moore School, they said, please be nonpartisan in this. I'm not sure how to do something nonpartisan. I'm not sure that really exists in the world today. I will try really, really hard to be bipartisan. Those of you who know me know that I am just as eager to beat up on my own party as I am on the other folks. And so I will not give you talking points from the Republican National Committee today, but I will give you my honest opinion about things that I see in Washington, D.C. And I want to talk about what's happening in Washington and how it impacts inflation. I'm going to do it in a way that's going to be different from what the other speakers are going to do. I'm not an economist. I used to be. I was an econ major in college. I was an econ major back when the debt to GDP, you can't see it, and I can't point to it with my laser pointer, so far my presentation's not going well. When the debt to GDP was about 60%. I was in college in the mid-1980s. By the way, this is one of my bipartisan slides. If you see that the debt to GDP was relatively stable for a long time, and that it started going up dramatically in the beginning of the 1980s when we had a Republican president. And over the course of the last 40 years, both parties have contributed to this graph that you see. But it goes back to the days when I was in college, when I was taking Samuelson, when I was learning Friedman, and I have forgotten most of it. So I'm not going to do much math today. There's two folks coming after me who are much better at that. I'm going to go more into the macro, into the fiscal policy, and talk about what's happening in Washington and how it impacts inflation. I will start, every time we talk about inflation these days, it seems everybody wants to talk about things that are temporary. Some people use the word transitory, although now I understand we're not supposed to use that word because no one apparently knows what it means. I'm not going to talk much about these things, mostly because most folks have already talked about them. So when you say, well, COVID has a tremendous impact on inflation, okay, it does, and there's a lot of discussion about that. Other folks are better capable of I'm telling you about that. You can get doctors involved. You can talk about Omicron. My favorite thing about this, now that we've learned how to pronounce it, is that I've heard people say the exact same thing, which is the new variant is going to make inflation better, and that the new variant is going to make inflation worse. The argument is that, well, the new Omicron is going to make it, it's going to be less virulent so that more people will be able to go back to work, so they will be able to make goods and services, provide goods and services that will thus lower inflationary pressure. Again, in my mind, and I'm old enough to remember what inflation used to be when I was a kid in the 1970s, 1980s. Inflation, too much money chasing too few goods. I know there's more than goes into that. You can deal with things like expectations of inflation, other things, but generally speaking, when you talk inflation, you're talking too much money chasing too few goods. So if Omicron is not going to be as deadly as the Delta variant, maybe people will stay at work, they will make more things, and that will bring inflation down. Conversely, people are telling me that, well, really what it's going to do is encourage more people to get out, and it will actually make inflation worse by being more active and more aggressive. I don't know, and I don't really care. I leave that to the doctors in the room. Spending bills, other transitory and temporary things. We've pumped about $6 trillion into the economy out of Washington, D.C. over the course of the COVID crisis. Not going to last forever. I will talk a little bit about why spending is going to last forever, but the temporary things you're seeing related to COVID coming out of Washington, D.C. Are not going to last forever. The best example of this is obviously the unemployment benefits, the temporary unemployment supplement that the federal government put in place. I think it was back in March or April of 2020. A lot of this expired in September. And what you saw in the first jobs report after the benefits expired was you had a number, I think 531,000 jobs created in the month of October. Temporary. Those were temporary changes to the system, not what I'm going to be talking much about today. I want to talk a little bit about midterm, and then I want to talk about really what I'm talking about, which is the permanent. What are the midterms, sort of the things that are not temporary, but they're not really here forever? There's a really good question, I think, as to whether or not the culture has changed. Whether or not government policy has helped change the culture, or whether or not just our culture has changed generally. Where we are going to live changed? Is how we shop going to change because of COVID? Is where we go to dinner and how we go to dinner going to change because of COVID? Again, sort of midterm influences on inflation. Government policy can impact that. Again, you go back to the way the benefits were handled. I learned a valuable lesson about benefits, about unemployment benefits, that I think was lost on me certainly before I had this experience. It goes all the way back to 2010. And I hear folks on the right saying, oh, we make it too easy for people not to work. People on the left saying, well, we don't do enough to take care of people when they need it. But I learned a valuable practical lesson about the impact of government policy when it comes to labor and whether or not people are going to work to make the goods and services that we buy. I was in Spartanburg, I think, at a plant that makes heat-treated metals for the automotive industries. This was back during the last financial crisis, 2010. And they were just coming out of their part of the recession. They were having difficulty finding people. And I went to the plant manager and I said, is it, as I've heard so often, a lack of skills? Do you not have the skill set here? Is the labor force in South Carolina not able to meet your skills need to do this manufacturing work? And the guy said, no, the skills are here. And I know the skills are here because we gave these folks the skills. The folks I'm trying to hire are the people that I had to lay off during the last downturn. And they've come back to me and they've said, I've got another 8 weeks of benefits left. Will you call me in 8 weeks? And at that point, I was sort of in the camp that said, well, it's because we make it too easy for people to stay home. And he said, Mick, it's not exactly that. He says, we pay $16 an hour here, okay? It's the kind of jobs, by the way, that everybody in this room says are the jobs that we want. $16 an hour, manufacturing, high value add, South Carolina. We all want this, right? He said, I figured out that my folks can make about $12 doing nothing, staying home. And in my mind, I immediately went to, why would you want to make 12 instead of 16? And I asked him, I said, that makes no sense to me, that folks are staying home doing nothing when they could be working and making more money. He says, Mick, that's not how you look at it. You look at the delta. You look at the delta. You're making $12 to do nothing, which means to get 16 hours to go to work for 40 hours a week, you're making $4 an hour for work. That stuck with me. It sticks with me to this day, that is how government policy isn't exactly one party says that it is, and it isn't exactly what the other party says that it is, but in the real world, it's sort of someplace in the middle. And that's one of the ways that government policy can impact us, mostly in the mid-term. The long-term stuff, though, is what I really want to talk about. I think we're to the point now where there are things that are happening in Washington, D.C. that are not going to change. They are not going to change anytime soon. The first one I want to talk about is the politicization of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be above politics. I don't remember having an opinion about Janet Yellen being named the Federal Reserve Chair in 2013 or 2014 when I was in Congress. I remember asking Ben Bernanke questions when I was on the House Financial Services Committee, I remember being critical of some of his decisions. I remember being critical of Janet Yellen's decisions. But I don't remember getting actively involved in whether or not Yellen should be appointed at the time by President Obama. Clearly, that has changed. And clearly this, along with everything else in the nation, is getting politicized. When members of the progressive wing of the Democrat Party start to say, look, we want to reimagine a Federal Reserve focused on eliminating climate risk and advancing racial and economic justice. Congratulations, you have now politicized the Federal Reserve. Leave it aside for a second. This is her quote. It says she was encouraging the president to reimagine. I would remind her the president doesn't get to reimagine what the Federal Reserve does. The Federal Reserve is a creature of statute. But when these types of pressures are out there, you cannot help but wonder how politically independent the Federal Reserve is going to be. That manifests itself, by the way, in a couple different ways. I don't know if anybody followed this or not. This was of some concern to me when I was in the administration. This was announced, I think, in early 2020, that the Federal Reserve had announced that they were going to reinterpret their dual mandate. Remember the dual mandate. The dual mandate they have by statute is maximum, not full, maximum employment and stable prices, not 2%. The statutory says maximum employment and stable prices. They've interpreted this now as full employment and 2% interest rates. But they changed that even further in 2020, and they came up with this thing called the flexible average inflation targeting. And the theory was this, is that we want 2% inflation. I don't think that's what the mandate says, but that's the decision that they have made. We want 2% inflation. And our policies over the course of the last decade or so have prevented us from going much above 2%. And if you're below 2% for a period of time, and you never get above 2% for any period of time, then you're never going to get to 2% on an average basis. So what they're going to start to do now is look at, well, if we've been below 2% for a while, we can tolerate inflation above 2% for a while. I put it to you, that is actually a political decision. That is not what's in the statute. That is their own decision to have decided to do that. Here's the difficulty, and here's where politics enters into this particular calculation. What do you need to have an average? You need two things. You need a data set, and when you're doing it over time, what do you need? You need a period of time. And they have not yet defined what period of time it is. So if you end up with low inflation for 5 years, like we've had the last 5 years, is it just going to be looking to higher possible inflation for the next 5 years? Or if you've got a lot of inflation in 1 year, you're going to then go back and shoot back for 2%? Or are you going to tolerate it for 3 or 4 years in order to allow that average to climb up back towards 2%? When you start to make decisions like this, you start to bring in politics to the issue. Again, it shouldn't be surprising because everything else in the nation is politicized. When you have to go through a Senate confirmation, as Jay Powell is going to do, it shouldn't surprise any of us that politics is coming into the Federal Reserve. Why does it matter? Again, if you're old enough to remember what happened with inflation in the 1970s and 80s, you remember how we fixed it, the dramatic increases in interest rates. You have to ask yourself, I think, and it's a fair question to ask. If you're sitting, and the whole point of this is you're sitting here trying to figure out what does the future look like, this is a fair question to ask. Will the Federal Reserve have the political will to do something that is really, really, really politically unpopular, if need be? I did see that just this morning, or just yesterday afternoon, Jay Powell announced that they were going to start looking at raising interest rates sooner, now that he's been renominated. But certainly there was not that commentary coming out of the Federal Reserve before Mr. Powell was nominated a few weeks back. So I think that tends long-term to lead us towards a more dovish approach to monetary policy simply because it's politically more expedient. By the way, there's one other thing I looked at when I was doing research for this piece on the Fed. Because, and I've had this conversation with folks who used to be on the Financial Services Committee with me, and we talk about the tools that are available to the Fed. Okay, if the Fed wants to slow the economy down, they can do a bunch of things. They can raise interest rates. One of the things they did in the last cycle when they tried to do a little bit of contraction was they raised what's called the interest on excess reserves. Banks are required to hold some money at the Federal Reserve at all times. Then they can also put extra money in there. And one of the things the Fed can and does do, one of the tools available to it, I think as of 2008, was to change the interest rate on what they give to the banks for the money sitting at their accounts at the Federal Reserve. Okay? there's an article, I was doing prep for a hearing in 2013. It's a great Financial Times interview with one of the heads, I think it was the St. Louis Fed, who said, I am really concerned about this tool. And they said, why? He said, because last year we gave the banks more money in interest on excess reserves than they made from their ordinary operations. Right? That's just the federal government giving them risk-free money for leaving money in the bank as opposed to putting it out in the economy. Now, there's perfectly good reasons for the Fed to do that. If you're trying to slow down an economy, you don't want that money sloshing around. Dr. Cruz is right. There's very little connection between M2 and inflation. There is some connection between the velocity of money and inflation. If you can slow the velocity down and leave that money in the bank, you do it. So it's a completely legitimate tool. But if in 2013 they were worried about the political perspective, how it would look politically to give the banks that much money for money that just sat there, imagine what it would be like in today's environment. And I was having that conversation. I went in to go Google a couple of terms just to make sure I was using the proper term. The term interest on excess reserves no longer exists. There's no such thing anymore at the Federal Reserve as excess reserves. In 2020, earlier this year, or early 2021 or late 2020, the Federal Reserve went in and changed its own language. And it no longer recognizes the difference between the amount of money that banks have to put in there and the amount of money the banks choose to put in there. They no longer have an interest on excess reserve. They have interest on reserves. And that's it. Okay? Just as curiously, guess what the required reserve percentage is right now? There's bankers in the room. Do you know what the number is as of March of 2020? It's 0. Banks are not required by law right now to keep any reserves at the Federal Reserve. They're allowed to keep all of their money in their own liquidity, okay? Which means that every single penny they're sitting on is an excess reserve, and they're paying interest on it. So again, you're looking forward. You end up in an inflationary market like we had in the 1970s. You know the tools that are available to the Federal Reserve. Is it really going to be possible for them to start to pay banks large sums of money in order to leave money at the Federal Reserve? I would suggest to you it's probably not as likely as it would have been in the 1970s and 1980s. And Jay Powell is not Paul Volcker, and the country is not what it was a generation ago. Again, I think that's one of those long-term trends that make us worry a little bit more about inflation. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the really, really permanent stuff that's happening in my former body, which is Congress, and in the White House to a certain extent. I want to talk about spending. In a perfect world, how much the government spends wouldn't have any influence on inflation, generally speaking. Again, it's too much money, too few goods. If the government is balancing its budget, it's taking money from you and it's giving it to you, but the total supply of money isn't changing that much. Yes, it might have some impact on the demand for goods if you've got a higher propensity to save and you've got a higher propensity to spend. So it could sort of on the edges change inflation, but generally speaking, when a government's running a balanced budget, it is not really inflationary or deflationary. Of course, we haven't done that now for about 20 years, okay? And I think you're moving to a point now where you're going to see permanent, large, regular annual deficits. Why? Because both parties love it. They just do. They'll lie to you and tell you that they don't. At least the Republicans will lie to you and tell you that they love it just as much as anybody. I know this is on the record, so I know this will probably leak out, but I'll beat up on a former friend of mine, okay? Gary Palmer's a friend of mine from Alabama. He's a Republican. Put out a really nice statement after the infrastructure bill passed about the Beltline around his city of Birmingham, Alabama. There's nothing unfactual about this. There's nothing wrong with this statement. This statement is completely wonderful. I think it's great. It's a priority for him. It's important for his city. It's one of the most important things to him. New funding is now passed. Yay, team. Do you think he voted for the bill? Nope, didn't. Happy to take credit for it, likes it. By the way, if you go to his page, he said, click here and see my full statement. The full statement says, this is really great, but the bigger bill stunk, so I voted against it, which is fine. But how many people click on that? We all love spending in Washington, D.C. I was one of the few people who hated it, which is why I really loved being the budget director. And when one party tells you the other party is responsible for debts, I want you to go back and think about this one. Because again, you don't get 30, and I think it's close to 30 trillion now, depending on how you want to count the debt at the Social Security Administration. You don't get there with just one party being responsible. Both parties go hand in hand up this graph right here. And that is not going to change, I don't think, anytime soon. There are things we do in Washington, D.C., the way we run Washington, D.C. is one of the reasons I think that this is unlikely to change. The culture in Washington, D.C. has changed just over the course of the 10 years since I've been there. The culture is now aimed at spending more, aimed at pumping more money every single year into the economy. I remember very vividly to my dying day, the only thing I think that Donald Trump ever agreed with Mitch McConnell saying in the entire time together was the time that Mitch McConnell sat in the Oval Office talking about one of my proposed budgets, and Mitch McConnell said, "Mr. President, nobody ever got reelected by spending less." It's a Republican Senate leader to a Republican president. Every time Nancy Pelosi sent over a proposed infrastructure bill, the first thing that the Trump administration wanted to do was double it in size. We like spending money. Everybody does. It's just a question of where do we spend it. The Democrats want to spend it on one thing, Republicans want to spend it on another. But the group of people in Washington, D.C. who are really fiscally conservative and worried about balancing the budget and worried about deficits is probably a quarter of the Republican Party. And by the way, can you blame them? I'm a deficit hawk. I've been wrong for the last 20 years. And I don't think much about modern monetary theory, the one that says you can essentially print as much money as you want to as long as inflation doesn't go up. But it certainly does explain what's been happening the last couple of years. I'll never forget, I was walking over to a budget meeting when I was a freshman, and one of the old bulls, one of the old Republicans who'd been there for 40 years was walking with me, and he said, "Oh, Mulvaney, I heard about you. You're one of those budget hawks." And I said, "Yeah, I am." Really goes, "Oh, I love you guys. You come every now and then you go away." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "You came when Reagan, and I was here and you left. And then you came again with Gingrich, and I was here, and you left. And you're here again today with the Tea Party, and you're going to be gone, and I'm still there. And I'm here giving a speech to you, and he's still in Washington, D.C. spending money." So there's certainly the pressure in both parties to do it. But beyond the culture, there's really three things that the way Washington works that leads towards more spending and more inflationary pressure. The first is how we count. The first is how we talk. And I learned this when I first got to the budget office and was going over previous budgets and going over statements about previous budgets. This is how Washington works. If you spent $100 on a program last year, okay, we give that program to the Congressional Budget Office, and the Congressional Budget Office drops it into a formula based roughly on inflation and population growth and says, okay, we are supposed to spend $103 on this program next year, supposed to spend. So we spent $100 last year, we're supposed to spend $103 on it next year. So if I come out with a budget that says I want to spend $98 instead of $100, in Washington, D.C., you call that a cut. I think we could all agree on that. If we spend $100 this year, $98 next year, that's a cut. If my budget says that I want to spend $100 next year, I would call that a freeze because I speak ordinary English. Washington, D.C. does not. If you spend $100 on a program last year and $100 next year, they call that a cut because you were supposed to spend $103. If I spend $103 next year, okay, instead of the $100, I would call that an increase. Washington, D.C. calls that a freeze because you're supposed to spend $103. You have to get up more than $103 before it's actually an increase because the system, the Congressional Budget Office system, the way we count says if you spent $100 last year, you're supposed to spend $103, and if you don't spend more than that, it's not an increase. Why do we do that? I saw this firsthand on more than one occasion. I saw it from both parties because Doug will walk in, and I know that he doesn't like this particular program. And now this year I've spent $100 on this program, and next year I'm going to spend $102 on this program. And I can look Doug right square in the eye and without lying say, "Doug, I agree with you. We cut spending on that program this year. Would you please vote for me again?" Okay? And when Dr. Cruz comes in, the next, I know he really likes that program. I can look him in the eye and say, "I want you to know we increased spending on that program this year." And you're not lying. You're telling everybody exactly what you want to hear, because the language is twisted in a way that allows you to manipulate what you're telling folks. But it's all aimed towards more spending. By the way, I'm not making this up. This was a Washington Post article. It goes beyond just what we're doing next year. Okay, this is an article that says the president's team of 30 decisions have to make some serious cuts to key priorities. The cuts required are going to be really ugly and really painful. Really ugly and really painful cuts. Guess how much money they spent on these proposed programs in the year that this article came out? Zero. This is all new spending. This is how they're talking about the social welfare bill, the human infrastructure bill. Haven't spent money on that. This is all looking forward. Well, we wanted to spend $2 trillion. Now we can only pass a bill that's $1 trillion, so we're going to have to cut spending. So it filters through every way that Washington, D.C. talks about spending. If you are not spending more, then you are cutting spending. We also count in a way that most we also count in a way that most folks don't. We count in 10-year increments most of the time. It's called the budget window. Again, it's a function of the Congressional Budget Office. If a program costs $5 billion a year and you're proposing this bill, then the Congressional Budget Office scores that as costing $50 billion. It makes sense, right? No problem. You're sort of projecting out. We don't take it out to infinity, but we know it's going to last more than a year. It's permanent law. So the ballpark we use is 10 years. What does that allow you to do? It allows you to manipulate how much things cost. How much things cost. And we do it all the time. In fact, it's happening right now with the social spending bill. Okay, this is how the Democrats are proposing to get their bill language down below the number that Joe Manchin wants, which is they're going to shorten the shelf life of several major programs in the plan to bring down the overall price tag. So instead of having a program be a 10-year program, they're going to have it be a 5-year program. That technically reduces the cost, at least in Washingtonese, by 50%. In fact, I was on national television a couple times saying, look, if you gave me this bill for long enough, I could get it down to probably $100 million by simply saying, folks, things are just going to last for 2 weeks. And that's completely legal, and we do it all the time. Okay? By the way, they are not the only party to do this. This is the reason that the Bush tax cuts expired back in 2000 and 2001. If they made them permanent, they would have cost more. So what they did is they made them temporary and put an expiration date on them because that way they supposedly cost less. What are both parties banking on? The Democrats are banking on the fact that once I give you something, they are not going to have the nerve to take it away from you. And the Republicans are saying, well, once I cut your taxes, they are not going to have the nerve to raise it on you. Okay? So it's a way to manipulate the system. What does it point towards? Every single time, it points towards more money. It also, by the way, allows folks to miscast other legislation. I'm on CNBC a good bit. One of my favorite foils on there, a guy I'm on there with a good bit is Austin Goolsbee, a Democrat economist and advisor. And this was his quote last time. I don't know if you can read it, so I'll read it out. It says, the Fed chair, we're talking about inflation. It says, the Fed chair isn't afraid of inflation. The impact of this bill, the social welfare bill we're talking about at the time, is very similar to what happened when the Trump administration cut taxes by $2 trillion. At this point, the social welfare bill was about this is the COVID stimulus bill of $2 trillion, COVID stimulus. Trump administration cut taxes by $2 trillion when the unemployment rate was only 4.1%, and that did not lead to inflation. As an insurance policy, I think you should run the economy hot. So what he's saying is, look, we are proposing in this COVID stimulus bill to spend $2 trillion, but it won't have any more impact on inflation than the Trump tax cuts, which were also $2 trillion. What's the difference between those two things? The COVID money is 1-year money, and the Trump bills scored over 10 years. They have nothing to do with each other. Trump tax cuts were about $200 billion a year. So it's 10 times as much impact in the first year as the Trump tax cuts. But it allows some folks like Austin Goolsbee to advocate for a particular bill by lying to you about the real impact of what the legislation is. And again, both parties are just as guilty of this on any given day, which at the end of the day allows folks to say these sorts of things with a straight face. Janet Yellen, these investments we expect will lead to a GDP increase in the long term without increasing the national debt or deficit by $1. We're going to spend $6 trillion and it won't impact the deficit. And of course, you all know the next one, the most famous one, which is the Build Back agenda costs zero. Okay. Do they believe it? Yeah, I really think they do. I think both parties do. Once you've been in Washington long enough, this is how you learn how to talk. And you can really convince yourself this is true. As Bill Clinton says, it's not lying if you really believe it. And I think both parties really believe that this is the way you should count when you are running a government. What's the point? It all points in one direction, which is to more spending. I'll say one last thing, then I'll shut up. The way we work also leads to larger spending. What do I mean by that? when the federal government runs properly, it should pass 13 individual small appropriation bills every single year, okay? That's one for defense, one for what we call state and foreign ops, one for healthcare, one for education, one for transportation. There's various committees, the Appropriations Committee, subcommittees, that pass their own bill, okay? And this worked for generations. And every now and then a president will be able to say, you know what, I'm okay with the defense spending bill, I'm not okay with the Health and Human Services bill, so I'm going to sign that bill, but I'm going to veto that bill, and y'all go back to the drawing board on this, okay? Does anybody know the last time that Congress passed all 13 appropriations bills? Probably not. 1996. 1996. I don't think they've passed more than 1 or 2 appropriation bills each year in the years that I have been in Washington, D.C. What does that lead to? Giant bills at the end of the year. By the way, it's one of the reasons we hear now so much about a government shutdown when we didn't hear that much about it before. The government shut down 20 times between 1977 and 1994. A partial government shutdown was typical because what would happen is they'd offer the president 13 bills, and the president would say, I don't like that one. He'd veto that, and then that little tiny portion of the government would shut down. But when Congress doesn't pass those individual bills and sends just a massive bill to the president essentially says, I have to take it or leave it. And if he doesn't like enough of it, he vetoes it, and the entire government shuts down. This leads to large, massive bills. Why does Washington like large, massive bills? Because they can do things like this. They can pass a $2 trillion COVID relief bill and look you in the eye and say, we spent $10 billion of this bill on PPE. That's a big number. It's a big number, and we needed it. We absolutely did. You could buy a lot of masks and a lot of tests for $10 billion. $10 billion is a lot of dough, okay? It's 0.5% of the whole bill. 35 times that amount was given to the states and cities in order to help bail them out. 35 times, $350 billion. By the way, put this in perspective. The budget of the United States in any given year is roughly $1.3 to $1.5 trillion. This single bill spent almost twice that and went through 1 or 2 hearings and was passed in a matter of weeks. The bills are just massive. And anytime you have a massive bill, there's going to be something that you like in it. And when I vote for it, you call me and say, why did you vote for this bill, Mr. Mulvaney? I thought you were a good fiscally conservative person. I say, well, look, there's $10 billion for PPE. And since most folks don't know that $10 billion is 0.5% of $2 trillion, if there was one word I would ban, I'm not big into banning language, by the way. I don't buy into the Orwell theory, but if I would ban a word, it would be trillion. Okay? $2 trillion is $2,000 billion. So we just passed a bill, $2,000 billion, but you should feel good because there's 10 of those 2,000 go to PPE, which is what you really wanted in the first place because you were afraid for the health and the well-being of your family. I thought of this, I was doing this morning, and I was walking out the door, and I saw a quote from Mrs. Pelosi that said that her social infrastructure, the social welfare, social spending bill is really pro-law enforcement because it has a couple $100 million in it for police programs. Again, out of $1.7 trillion. Anytime you have a bill that's that big, you are going to be able to find something in it that everybody that votes for you likes. And this is why both parties have gravitated towards approving these massive bills. Keep in mind, we were just as guilty. We controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House during the first 2 years of the Trump administration. We didn't pass any appropriations bills. I think we have passed one. Okay. By the way, the rate of spending increased more during the 2 years that the Republicans were in charge of all branches of government than they did during the last 2 years of the Obama administration. Don't let either party tell you that they care more about spending. They don't. They care about how that money is spent. I said that was the last thing. This is the last thing. I have a great conversation with some good friends of mine, some economists in D.C., and they point out to me that I could be entirely wrong. Which, by the way, since I'm no longer running for office, I can tell you, yeah, I probably could be. I don't think it should undermine what I'm saying. Most folks who talk about this are wrong at one point or the other. Most folks who work for the Federal Reserve right now have been wrong about this for the last couple of months. So at least I'm no worse off than they are. But I've heard some really good arguments as to why this long-term pressure that I'm talking about on inflation won't be that much of a problem. That there'll be other things happening in the economy that will offset this permanent, and I do believe it to be a permanent inflationary push coming out of fiscal policy. And number one is the birth rate. Our birth rate has dropped. There's no question about it. They tend to do that in wealthy economies anyway. I have a friend of mine who's actually more worried about us going into a Japan-style malaise and possible deflation than inflation. It's a risk. It certainly is. If my party would ever wake up and realize that the majority of first-generation Americans vote conservative, that maybe we can get our act together and figure out a better immigration policy than we have right now, because that's traditionally, at least the last couple of generations, how this country has dealt with our lower birth rates. We've encouraged immigration, so we could fix that. But certainly, if we don't fix immigration and we don't fix our birth rates, yeah, you've got a demographic problem when it comes to inflation. And enough folks make an argument that digitization might make a difference. This was actually a great debate we had on CNBC one morning. A guy said, look, Mick, you're right when you talk about the macro issues, but what you're ignoring is that it is so much easier now to provide many of the services and some of the goods that we do. It's almost free. Okay? I watched a streaming movie last night. What did it cost Netflix to give that to me? Practically nothing. How hard was it? It was really easy. The digitization of the goods and services, especially services that we consume, is really easy, and that will have deflationary tendencies in the long run. There's folks who used to remember that when you were in college, what was your largest monthly bill other than beer? It was probably your long-distance phone bill. Now it's practically free. If someone walked up to you and said, can I use your phone to make a long-distance call? You do it in a second. So there is that tendency in some industries and goods and services for prices to come down over the long term, and I think that would be a deflationary pressure. The last one, of course, they talk about is robotics and automation, but I'll leave that to other folks. Look, we're going to take some questions here. I hope this is the takeaway that you've got. What did I want to do here today? Inflation is a multivariable equation. There's a lot of things that impact the supply of money in the system and the supply of goods and services. I even forgot to talk about regulation and how government policy can reduce the ability to get goods and services to market. Getting rid of the Keystone Pipeline cost us 850,000 gallons of oil a day in this country. We just released 50 million gallons out of the strategic reserve in order to help lower prices. All you needed was 2 months worth of a Keystone Pipeline. You have the exact same impact as the release of those 50 million gallons of oil. So regulatory climate certainly has a role as well. But when you look at all those variables, many things are going to change from time to time. COVID is going to change. Regulations will change. Some things, though, are not going to change going forward. And when you sit down and try and look into the future, I think it's safe to assume that for our foreseeable future, for our lifetimes, the pressure coming out of Washington, D.C. using fiscal policy will be pro-inflationary. I'm not sure that was worth your time for the last 30 minutes or so, but we'll find out during the questions. Listen, thanks very much for having me. Look forward to hearing what you folks have to say about it. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you for the fascinating, unique, and largely nonpartisan comments on Washington. Bipartisan. Oh, yes, you have such a great knowledge of how Washington works, and this is why we wanted to invite you here, because now more than ever, especially in this COVID economy that when I'll be talking about that. By the way, I'm Doug Woodward. For those of you who don't know, I'll be talking after our break. But one thing that we've learned during this COVID economy is how important Washington has been in driving this economy. So we really need to understand more about how Washington works to understand the outlook for the South Carolina economy. After the break, Dr. Joey Van Nessen will be talking about our outlook for the South Carolina economy. But we have some time now. We actually had a speaker coming also after Ambassador Mulvaney's talk to speak to us from the Federal Reserve. You might have seen that early on in our program, but she had to drop out because they're not allowing her to talk. The Federal Reserve is meeting. Did you know this? Yeah,
No,
you're talking about the Federal Reserve being politicized. I'm not sure this was a political decision. No Federal Reserve economist, and we really wanted one here today because they're so important in our economy these days, but no Federal Reserve economist can speak right now before the big meeting next week, and there is a major meeting of the Federal Reserve that's going to change monetary policy. I'll talk about that next week, and they don't want anyone talking. So she had to drop out at the last minute. So we have some extra time. We would like to open it up for questions now for Ambassador Mulvaney. Please. Oh, so many, I don't know where to start. Back here. There we go. And we'll bring a microphone around you. And this is also open for those of you who are online. So please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ambassador Mulvaney, for your service for our country, and thank you for coming and joining us today. My name is Alan Brown, and I'm with the Small Business Development Center here at the University of South Carolina. You made a statement in your comments that the country is not what it used to be a generation ago. Mm-hmm. Could you expound upon that and tell me what you mean? And then if we're not, where the gap is and some things that we can do locally to make sure that we're moving our economy and our generation forward?
Yeah, I think that comment, I know what that comment meant because I made it. The comment deals with how we deal with politics. I was reading about Bob Dole, who just recently passed away, and when he lost the election in 1996 to Bill Clinton invited him shortly thereafter to the White House and awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Ask yourself if that would happen today. Not going to happen. The country is much more divided than it was. Everything is politicized. I don't remember talking to my wife when she was my girlfriend about politics. I don't remember talking to her about politics until I was talking about going into politics. Now, okay, I'll answer it this way. People ask me what keeps me up at night, and it's not the debt. It used to be. It's not the debt. I had an experience with a group of young people from the University of the other USC, University of Southern California. Their honors presidential scholars came to Washington, D.C., and I spoke to them along with a friend of mine, John Carl. John is a reporter from ABC News. You may have seen him. He just wrote a book. And we were dissecting my press conference regarding financial support to the Ukraine. And John had been very critical of it, reported on it, and he gave his side of what he thought he saw. I talked about it. And we got pretty heated in it as John was telling me what he thought I was thinking, and I told him what I was really thinking. But anyway, and then we were taking questions. He left, and I was hanging around with the students. Again, this is the honor. This is the best of the best at the other USC. And there was a young woman there, and she asked me, she goes, "Can I ask you a personal question?" I said, "Sure, I guess." She says, "Are you friends with that guy?" I said, "Yeah. Yeah, we go to baseball games together. We go to dinner together. I mean, yeah, we are socially friends. Our kids go to University of Virginia together. We are friends." "Why do you ask?" She goes, "Because it seems like you disagree about what you guys are talking about." I said, "Yeah, we do." She goes, "Well, I don't understand that." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, I have been raised to know that everybody is entitled to their own opinion." And I'm thinking, okay, yay. And she goes, "And everybody's opinion is just equally as valid as the next." And I'm like, I don't like where this is going. And she says, "But I could never be friends with somebody who disagrees with me." And I said, "I'm sorry, what?" She goes, "Yeah, I could never be friends." And I spent about an hour and a half with the kids, and I sort of get a feel there were conservatives in the room, there were liberals. She was more left of center than some of the other kids. And there's another guy she didn't talk to. I said, "What about that guy? You're not friends with him? He seems like he's a decent guy." She goes, "Oh yeah, no, he's a very nice man, but he's a Republican, and I would never be friends with him." That's what I talk about. I think social media has a great deal to do with it. I think the breakdown of various institutions has a great deal to do with it. And we could talk hours and hours about how we got there, but that's when I say that we are a different country than we were before. That's what I mean. If you have inflation like you had in 1977, I don't think you'd see the same response as you did as a nation, where the nation was willing to tolerate, to a certain extent, the higher interest rates because they knew it was important to fix the economy. I dare say that if you had an attack similar to what you had on September 11th today, that the response would be nearly as unified as it was just 20 years ago. So that's what I mean when I say the country is different than it was a generation ago.
Okay, thank you. Okay, back here.
Congressman Mulvaney, when I listen to you, I'm reminded that we seem to be rampant inflation and all of these. What could you say to us that would give us some hope?
Yeah.
It sounds like the system is broken. The institutions that are the emergency brakes are broken. Don't leave us there, please. Give us a little bit of hope.
Yeah, I don't know if it's hope as much as it is some balance, right? And because I've been wrong for a long time. I'm a deficit hawk. I'm still a deficit hawk. But I feel like I'm the guy standing on the corner with the sign saying, "Repent, the end is near." Sooner or later, that guy's going to be right. But not today, okay? That's sort of how I felt for the last 10 years. Because I've been telling people, well, once debt to GDP gets to 80%, it's going to impact growth. Well, once it gets to 100%, it's going to impact growth. Once it gets to 120%, the world is going to end. And it hasn't happened. That's why I could look at MMT and say, children came up with this, but it does tend to accurately reflect what's happened over the course of the last couple of decades. And when you read the academic literature, the one explanation I perceive that makes sense is that it's different when you own the reserve currency. And that's why we're different than Venezuela, we're different than Argentina, we're different than Zimbabwe. We have the reserve currency, and that the same math doesn't apply when you do possess the reserve currency. Do I think that means you get to go all the way to MMT? No, I don't. I think sooner or later you have to pay the piper. And heaven forbid you should lose the reserve currency status. I don't see that happening. I really don't, because there's a lot more things that go into reserve currency than just your fiscal and monetary policy. You may love the yuan, okay? But do you love the fact that Chinese government can tell you what it's worth tomorrow? Do you really want to write a contract to be enforced in Chinese courts? You may love the euro. Is it going to exist in 20 years? So there's all sorts of other things that go into consideration as to what makes a reserve currency. So if there's hope, it would be that we have more leeway, we have more, a longer leash before we end up paying the price that all those other economies have paid. And the other thing is that really, are you moving into a world where everything's relative? And you don't have to have a strong economy, or excuse me, a strong currency, you just have to have one that's stronger than everybody else. And while we're sitting here running up these deficits and these debts, so is everybody else. So is that one of the other things that, again, does it give you hope? I'm not sure it gives you hope as much as it opens the door to where things won't be as bad as they are as quickly as I think they should be, and that you do get a chance to fix things.
I just say I totally agree with that. We are very privileged to have the dollar. We couldn't be getting away with the things we're doing in Washington without having the dollar as a reserve currency and the go-to currency when there's a crisis that everybody wants to hold. That's how we're continuing to do well despite everything exploding.
I remember when the S&P changed our credit rating back in 2013. I got blamed for that, by the way, because we were debating the debt ceiling. If you read the S&P report, by the way, which I have, it doesn't say they lowered our credit rating because of the standoff. They said they were lowering it because it was clear to them that we were not going to address our fiscal problems. But anyway, that's not the point. Point is, our debt rating went down, and our interest rates went down, which is the exact opposite of what you would expect to happen. But it was because everybody else was weaker than we were.
That's right, exactly. Okay, Gary.
If I may.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll leave that to the economists. Again, that moves into the math that I haven't done since the 1980s, but I'll give you sort of a off-the-cuff response, which is that, I mean, if you want to spend $100 a day, okay, and that's what you're spending, and you've got $100 in your bank account, your velocity is 1. If I give you $900 more, but you don't want to spend more than 100, your velocity is now 1/10, right? So the more money has simply lowered the velocity of money. Until you have more economic activity, you're not going to see the velocity increase. How did I do on that, Professor?
That's pretty good. I'm going to be addressing that too in my remarks, so we'll come back to that. But that's a good question and a bit technical and complicated. So I will talk about that as well after the break when I talk.
Sir,
okay, over here.
You were most informative about how the fiscal spending works. Could you address just a moment what really goes on in Congress when they're talking about spending bills and not really talking about how to finance them other than some...
I don't know, I can tell you another story, which is that every year when we have votes on the floor on appropriation bills, again, in order for a bill to pass, it has to pass the House and the Senate. The Senate might pass a couple of appropriations bills. The House may pass different ones. So you still vote on bills even though ultimately they don't become law. So we had plenty of votes on appropriation bills. And every single year, who's the senator from Kentucky? Marsha Blackburn. Every single year, Marsha Blackburn would introduce an amendment on whatever the bill was. And the bill was to reduce whatever the number was by a penny on the dollar. Across the board, 1% reduction in spending on that bill. Let's call it the Department of Interior, okay? And she offers a 1% across the board reduction. And there would be the same 50 Republicans that would vote for that every single year. And a majority of Republicans and every single Democrat would vote against that bill every single year. And that's how you end up spending that much money, is that the folks who are interested in spending less make up a very small minority, probably, like I said, 25% of the Republican Party. There's just not enough people interested in spending less. Why? Because it doesn't get them reelected. Mitch McConnell is right, okay? I don't think a single member of Congress has ever lost his or her job for spending too much. It's the devil's bargain that the Republicans and Democrats made in 1980 with Ronald Reagan, when they figured out that Republicans wanted to lower taxes and the Democrats wanted to spend more. And what they got together said, you know what, you can cut your taxes and I can spend more and we'll both get reelected because we can just borrow the money. And that's what we've done every year since 1980. There's, on that graph, it's not up there anymore, but the line starts to move dramatically in 1980 under Republican White House and a Democratic House. By the way, the time that the line is the flattest over the course of the last 40 years is when you've been under divided government. That's the closest we come to having any fiscal discipline, is when the parties split control of the levers of power. Like I said, the first 2 years of the Trump administration, we grew government faster than Obama did in his last 2 years. Because when in his last 2 years, it was split government, you put us in charge, and we ended up growing the government very quickly.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions before we take a break. Yes.
Howdy, welcome home, Mr. Ambassador. It's great to see you. I need to tell everybody I met the ambassador out in the hallway, and he talked about inflationary pressures on his golf game, and he blamed it on his opponent, Mr. Dowdy.
Gowdy stepped on my ball in a sand trap. I absolutely believe that.
Sir, you didn't talk about the fact that we've been successful in this great state of bringing jobs here, new industry. But the issue now, at least for my county, and I know from a number of people I've been talking to, is getting people back to work. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Sure. I'll try to keep it in the context of what I'm talking about, is that what are we going to, if you want more of something, you subsidize it. If you want less of it, you tax it, right? That's pretty basic. I learned that first day in macroeconomics. And we, to a certain extent, subsidize unemployment. We're not doing it as much now as we were 3 months ago, but we still do. As long as we continue to do that, you continue to have that same conversation that those folks at that automotive plant in Spartanburg had 10 years ago, which is, where's the break even? The unemployment rate is what, 4.1% as of last Friday, but we're still 2 or 3 million jobs short of where we were. What does that tell you? That's 2 or 3 million. If the inflation rate is, by the way, I pay no attention to the unemployment rate. In my mind, it is a meaningless number. Now, if you want to pay attention to something on a monthly basis, when the jobs numbers come out the first Friday, by the way, it was really cool when I was a chief, and the OMB director, I got to see them about half an hour before they came out. That was a neat part of the job. Pay attention to the number. If the number's below 250,000, it's a bad number. If the number's above 250,000, it's a good number. Why do I say that? Because the unemployment rate is a formula. It's a fraction. The number of people working over the number of people who want to work. If everybody in the country who was not working said they did not want to work, the unemployment rate would be 0, even though you could have millions of people out of work. Okay? So I don't look at that rate. What I look at is the number of jobs that are created. And now I completely lost my train of thought. So I'm sorry about that, Julian. What can we do to create, to help jobs? To the point now where where's that break-even point? Where people say, okay, I can make X to do nothing, or I can make Y to go to work. There are 2 factors in that. If the X to do nothing, which is the government subsidy, comes down, and the payroll, the pay goes up, and the delta expands, you're going to pull more people back into the workforce. There's a bunch of different ways to do that, but the private sector's in charge of one, government's in charge of another. I'm absolutely convinced, by the way, that part of the reason that this administration focused so heavily on unemployment benefits was because it was a way to get to a de facto $15 an hour minimum wage. Because they understand the math. The math is not hard. And if you can move that number up that you make by doing nothing, it then moves that number up that the employers have to pay in order to get you to come back to work, come back into the workforce. And you go to KFC now in Indiana, they're paying $15 an hour. It's not law, but it's a function of government policy combined with other things, including COVID.
I'll just say that after the break and Dr. Von Nessen speaks, we'll be talking about the South Carolina labor market a lot. I hope you're going to learn a lot. It's very interesting what's happening in the labor market right now. We've never seen anything like this. So I think now would be a good time to take a break. We'll have more Q&A after Dr. Von Nessen's talk on the South Carolina economic outlook and my speech. So we'll pick up the conversation again, and we'll be back at 2:15, okay? Thank you again. Okay, everybody? Again, as you know, I'm Doug Woodward, Professor of Economics and Director of the Division of Research at the USC. In this part of the program, this the reason a lot of you have come, and I see many faces have come back many, many years now. It's good to see you all again. It's actually just great to see people live rather than virtually. It's the same with teaching students. It just makes a huge difference to see people rather than just be on Zoom all the time. So thank you for coming, and for those of you on Zoom, thank you also for participating. So in this part of the program, we're going to start with Dr. Joey Von Nessen. Many of you know he's been with USC now for 12 years. He's our chief economic forecaster. He's going to be presenting the outlook for South Carolina in 2022. Joey.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you again for being here. My name is Joey Von Nessen, and I'm a research economist here in the Darla Moore School of Business. And I don't feel any richer, I have to say, after the previous comments. And I'm not going to talk about monetary and fiscal policy this afternoon. We're going to dial it back and talk a little bit more about what's going on in South Carolina. We'll talk about what's been happening over the last 18 months or so, where we are today, and where we're headed as we move forward into 2022 and look ahead to what South Carolina has in store for the new year in terms of our overall economic outlook. And to really start and to set the framework for this discussion this afternoon, I think it's important to, first of all, look back at the great expansion that we came out of going into the pandemic recession in early 2020, and to think about that, because the recession that we just went through was very unique in its cause, as we all know, and that has, as a result, led to a fairly unique recovery period that we've seen so far. And that, in turn, is leading to how we provide an outlook for 2022. That has implications for what South Carolina's economy is likely to do going forward. If we look at the great expansion over the previous decade, it was the longest economic expansion on record, going back to World War II, so 128 months from July of 2009 up through February of 2020. And that expansion, as we all know, was derailed not by any fundamental economic failure, but rather by a government-imposed shutdown. And as a result, when the economy then reopened shortly thereafter, we were able to see a much more rapid rebound. And so because of this, we can really think about COVID-19 as effectively forcing us to push the pause button on this great expansion that we experienced over the past decade. And so it was a very different end to an expansion compared to what we've seen before. And it has allowed us to recover much faster in the months since then, in the roughly 18 months since then. And we can see this very clearly if we look at the data and just compare what's been happening since the economy reopened in 2020 and compare that recovery in South Carolina. This looks at employment today as a percentage of its pre-recession peak, both for the COVID recession, which you can see, and also the Great Recession in red. And just notice how much longer it took South Carolina's economy to recover in terms of overall employment following the Great Recession in 2008 as opposed to what we've seen in the last 18 months or so. And by the way, I loved the ambassador's comments on when he was talking about the unemployment rate and how that can be a bit misleading. It's very important to look at the labor force itself. It's important to look at employment totals as well. And so that's what we want to look at here. We can actually see employment recovery because that gives us a much more accurate metric of recovery. So you can see here that it took about 6 years total to recover from the Great Recession in terms of jobs in South Carolina, compared to how much more rapidly that we have rebounded from the COVID recession in 2020. And again, we are rapidly approaching pre-COVID levels of employment in South Carolina. So this puts us in a very strong position as we move forward, because by multiple metrics in South Carolina, not just employment, we've actually seen South Carolina approaching pre-pandemic levels of economic activity, which puts us in a very strong position going into 2022, and basically allows us to be able to perhaps push play again on that great expansion that we lost in early 2020, barring any, of course, additional COVID variants that could potentially create additional uncertainty with respect to consumer confidence and so forth. But fundamentally, the economy is in very good shape. South Carolina is doing well in terms of the overall recovery, and we are poised to have a very strong year in 2022. Now, what does this look like, and where's the specific evidence for this? Where can we see the data points that illustrate the fact that we've seen such a strong recovery and we're in a position to move back to basically hit play again on the great expansion that we were experiencing over the previous decade? Well, we can break down our economic metrics into the very basics, supply and demand, of course. As economists, we always like to come back to those fundamentals. And so I want to look at each piece separately and what the data show in terms of the supply side and the demand side of our economy right now, and what that bodes for 2022 for our state. So first, let's start out on the supply side. And specifically, we want to look at what's going on with the labor supply. Of course, there is a lot of discussion. We all see the labor shortage every day. I'm going to talk about that specifically. But we can think more generally about what the supply side of the economy looks like right now and how we've seen recovery, again, over the last 18 months or so since the economy reopened in April of 2020. So the first way we can see this is look at actual employment changes. So I alluded to this before, but here you can explicitly see South Carolina employment levels and how they have changed since 2020. We see the recession, of course, followed by the rebound of jobs and the restoration of many jobs that have come about since then. And as of today, or October of 2021, which is the latest month for which we have data, we're within about 1.8% of pre-pandemic employment levels as a state overall, compared to where we were back in February of 2020 specifically, 1.8%. And this percentage is actually a bit of a conservative estimate because it's highly skewed by the leisure and hospitality sector, which is the sector we would expect to skew because it is the one that was hardest hit. It lost about 50% of its jobs in 2020, and it's still between about 8 and 10% down compared to pre-recession levels. So that skews this number considerably. When we remove that completely, we find that all other sectors on average are within about 0.8 percentage points, so less than 1% away from pre-pandemic levels of employment. And we will almost certainly get to employment levels that we were at in February of 2020 in South Carolina sometime next year. So again, a very positive picture here for South Carolina in terms of the recovery that we're seeing so far. Now, we can break this down a little bit more by industry. I'm not going to go through each one specifically, but this is just to drive home the point that most industry sectors in South Carolina are either approaching pre-recession employment levels or have already surpassed pre-recession employment levels. And that's especially true for sectors like construction, as you see here, and logistics, among several others. And these percentages at the top of your screen basically just represent the current level of employment today for each sector relative to where it was in February of 2020. So with the exception of leisure and hospitality, really across the board, we see employment levels that are close to comparable or even in some cases exceeding what they were before the pandemic began. So we see considerable progress, broad-based recovery across the board in 2021. This extends, of course, to regions within South Carolina as well. Again, I'm not going to go through necessarily each specific region in South Carolina, but you can get a general sense of which areas of the state have recovered at faster rates in terms of the percentage of lost jobs that have been recovered since February of 2020. And generally, when we look across regions within South Carolina, we see a pattern of regions that are doing well, primarily being those that are dominated by manufacturing, and also those that are benefiting from population growth and ensuing construction demand that results from that population growth. So this translates into additional economic activity in the upstate. So the upstate, we've seen some of the highest recovery rates in South Carolina, certainly over the last year and over the last year and a half. And then also in coastal South Carolina, as we've seen more people moving into South Carolina over the last year and a half, and that has stimulated the demand for housing, as well as all of the related services resulting from additional population in migration and additional growth in local regions. So if we look at coastal South Carolina and the upstate, we see where the regions of the state that are doing the best in terms of overall recovery from an employment perspective. And so as we look out then, going forward, as I mentioned, we will very likely return to pre-pandemic levels of employment in 2022. And this is true, we think, because if we look at a variety of projections, just straight projections outward based on different growth rates that we've been experiencing over the last several years, in most scenarios, we actually do see full employment recovery in 2022. Not in every scenario, but in most cases. So again, from an employment perspective, we fully expect for full recovery to occur, or is very likely to occur in 2022. So our employment picture in South Carolina is very strong. Other metrics where we can see South Carolina on the supply side doing very well and our recovery coming along very nicely. One is to look at unemployment insurance claims in South Carolina. Both initial claims and continued claims now are at pre-recession levels. Again, getting back to a period of economic metrics that are comparable to what we were seeing before the pandemic began during that great expansion. So initial unemployment insurance claims represent newly laid off people. So layoff activity is down, and continued unemployment insurance claims as a broader representation of the total unemployed population in South Carolina, also down below pre-pandemic levels. So both metrics, again, fully recovered and look and bode well for the labor market as we move ahead into 2022. This also translates into a very low unemployment rate, and we have to look at the components of the unemployment rate, of course, and we've looked at total employment. We're going to talk about the labor force as well in a moment, but the unemployment rate itself, which is commonly used to indicate the health of the labor market, you can see here 3.9%, already under 4% in South Carolina, down from approximately 11.5% in April of 2020. So well below our standard measure of full employment that economists typically use, which is right around 5.0% as an unemployment rate. So unemployment now, again, represents a very strong labor market right now. And full employment suggests that if people are looking for a job, they typically are able to find a job, meaning that the lack of availability of jobs is simply not an issue in South Carolina or in the U.S. when we have a period of full employment, which we do now. So the unemployment rate, again, very much comparable to what we were seeing before the pandemic began during the last decade. And then if we look at the size of the labor force, this is another important metric to watch as well, because of course it goes into defining how we look at or into calculating the unemployment rate itself, as we heard earlier. And this is one area where South Carolina has actually done uniquely well. So we have fully recovered in terms of the number of people in the labor force in South Carolina. We're actually up about 1.8% compared to January of 2020. And this puts us in very select company, it turns out. We're one of only 11 states in the country that has a labor force today that is higher than it was in February of 2020, before the pandemic began. And so I can share with you a map here just to give you a feel for which states are similar to South Carolina in this metric. You can see in dark red states that are well below the national average in terms of the current size of the labor force. Again, relative to where it was in February 2020, light red represents those that aren't doing quite so poorly, recovered more And then green, the 11 states that have recovered completely since in terms of the losses to the labor force. So South Carolina very much in select company here. The only state in the Southeast, except for Florida, where this is true. And I'm going to come back and talk about this more specifically in a few moments, but one of the primary reasons why this is the case is because of population growth that we have seen in South Carolina, relative population growth compared to the rest of the country, which has allowed more people to enter the labor force as we've needed that recovery over the last 18 months. So very unique position for South Carolina in terms of the size of the labor force. Now, this is not to say that our labor force participation rate has fully recovered. It has not. It is still down about 0.5 percentage points versus January of 2020. So the labor force participation rate is a ratio of looking at the labor force as a percentage of the population as a whole. And you can see more generally in South Carolina, labor force participation has been ticking downwards for many years, certainly going back as far as 2007, consistently decreasing, as you can see here. So the fact that the labor force participation rate is down now is actually more a representation of long-term structural shifts in South Carolina in terms of our population and our aging demographics than it is to do with what's been happening with COVID over the last 18 months. So still not fully recovered in labor force participation, but again, this is as much a long-term phenomenon as it is a short-term phenomenon. But regardless, we are getting close to labor force participation rates, even though, again, by historical standards, it's still fairly low in South Carolina. And our labor force participation rate tends to be lower than the national average because we do have an older population. So fewer people, a smaller percentage of our population is actively looking for work. So that gives us a sense of what's going on the supply side, right? So if we think about labor supply, we think about the supply side of our economy. And from an employment perspective, by all these different metrics, things are looking pretty strong, getting very much back to where we were during the Great Expansion, during the later years of the Great Expansion. Again, giving us reason to think that we can really hit play on that Great Expansion again in 2022 as these remaining metrics begin to fully resolve and move back to pre-COVID levels of activity. So what can we say then about the other side of the equation? What if we look at demand? How is demand changing, and how is it driving the recovery that we've seen over the last 18 months or so, and what does that imply for South Carolina? Well, first of all, we can look at different measures of demand. The broadest way to see this, of course, is to look at GDP. So this is GDP growth trends for the United States going back over the last several years, just to put into perspective where we are today compared to what we've seen in recent years. You can see the most recent GDP growth estimate for the United States at 2.1%. That's coming off of rates of slightly over 6% earlier this year. And most economists are projecting right now that when all is said and done for 2021, GDP growth will settle in for the United States around 6% and probably drop to between 3 and 4% in 2022. Again, this accelerated rate of growth that we're seeing this year, largely due to the recovery that will settle back down as we enter a more standard economic expansion. Again, as we push play on this great expansion once again moving forward. Now, in South Carolina, we see good news when we look at GDP as well. So we can look not only at GDP growth, the growth rates as you see here, but we can look at the absolute levels of GDP as well, which is what this graph actually shows you. So South Carolina GDP levels, so not growth. And this represents the overall size of the economy in South Carolina. And so notice that over the past year, we've actually seen complete recovery in terms of GDP levels following the decline during the recession in 2020. So again, getting us back to this pre-COVID level of economic activity. And not only is the level of activity itself exceeding where we were in early 2020, but if we look at this long-term trend, we also see that we're back to the trend line, so to speak. So one other way that we can look at these figures is to actually project a long-run trend line onto the historical data, onto GDP for South Carolina, and just ask ourselves where, if we were in 2018 or 2019 and using a naive forecast here where we look at nothing but the existing trend line, where would we expect GDP in South Carolina to be today if nothing else had happened? right? If we had just continued on with that great expansion. And the answer is we'd be pretty close to where we are now. So not only has GDP itself fully recovered, but we've also gotten back close to what our historic trends have been in South Carolina, again, over the previous decade. So another sign that we're seeing full recovery from a demand perspective. Now, where does GDP come from? What elements of GDP are the most important to be tracking as we look not only at what's been happening so far in terms of demand, but in terms of what can give us some insight about where we're likely to head in 2022 when we begin to think about leading indicators. And one way to look at or to think about a leading indicator that's going to be important to track going forward is going to be this metric of consumer spending. So consumer spending, as we know, is a major component of GDP. It's the biggest component of overall GDP. About 70% of the U.S. economy comes from consumer spending. So it's a very important metric to track, not just looking at GDP as a whole, but actually breaking it down. And consumer spending, as you can see here from a U.S. perspective, fully recovered in 2020 and in 2021, and in fact is significantly above what the trend line would suggest that it would otherwise be. So we're actually about 3.8% above trend. Now, why is this the case? Well, there are two reasons. One reason is that we've seen more people come back into the labor force, more people are going back to work, and we're back to a period where we're basically at full employment in the U.S. and South Carolina economy. So people are earning their incomes, earning wages again, and they're spending. And so that's going to, of course, boost and help restore consumer spending to levels that we would otherwise expect it to be. Then secondly, of course, we're coming off a period that we heard about of extended stimulus, and we're going to hear more about. And that stimulus included stimulus checks to Americans. It included federal unemployment benefits that supplemented state-level benefits. So there were a number of different programs that provided stimulus dollars to Americans. So as we've seen those stimulus dollars spent, as well as the employment situation improve, we have two sources of consumer spending that are coming together and creating this level of elevated spending that's now significantly above what we would otherwise expect it to be, this historical trend line, again, above by about 3.8%. Now, we can see this more specifically if we think about the result from the stimulus dollars as having specific implications for disposable income and for savings rates for Americans. So if we think about these dollars that have come in, that's generated more spending, and that has generated more disposable income that created that spending. And so we can actually see that impact when we look at the data here as well. So disposable personal income, you can see about 2.6% above trend currently. And this has actually come down quite a bit. So you can see the major change just in the last year regarding a difference from historic trends that have been occurring over the previous decade. So a sizable increase in disposable income due to spending associated with the stimulus package, which has come back down, but still elevated by about 2.5%. So still well above that trend line. Again, helping to generate that consumer spending that is elevated above its overall trend line as well. And then we see this in terms of savings rates, which have come down recently, but also have been significantly elevated over the last year and a half or so. So again, thinking about these stimulus dollars, that's generating more disposable income. It's generated much higher savings rates as a whole. Now savings are actually below trend by about 1.3%. So this tells us that those savings which have accumulated in households, in individual households, are now actually being expended, actually are being spent out. So when you've got a combination of disposable income that's still elevated with these savings rates, which had been elevated but now are being spent, it makes sense that we're going to see elevated consumer spending overall. That's where this is coming from. That's where this demand is coming from. So in both cases, we see very clearly these changes in the data and how they explain consumer spending overall. And so going forward then, what does this tell us about 2022? Is this sustainable? Well, one bottom line conclusion that we can take away from looking at consumer spending overall is that the growth rate is likely to taper in 2022. And by taper, we mean begin to revert back to historical trends. So that 3.8% in consumer spending that we are currently seeing that's above trend cannot go on forever because it's largely driven by the elevated disposable income and by these elevated savings rates that are now being spent out. And we didn't add those up explicitly, but you'll actually notice that if you add up the percentage increase in disposable income with the percentage decrease in the savings rate, where we are currently, that gets pretty close to that 3.8% we saw in terms of the elevated consumer spending above historical trends. So this is explaining a lot of that elevated activity. And again, as those dollars are spent down, then we expect for consumer spending overall to begin to taper off and get closer to this long-run trend, which is more compatible with a full employment picture. Again, getting back to these norms of the great expansion that we were in before 2020. Now, there's another component of consumer spending that we need to think about. Let's break it down a little bit further. So we started by looking at GDP as a proxy for demand. We looked at one important component, the biggest component, consumer spending, and then we can break that down even further and look at consumer spending and the difference between the goods market and the services market. And here, of course, you see a wildly different story, right? So, okay, we're up about 3.8% overall, but that's not what we see at all here when we break it down into the goods market and the services market. Very clearly, we see a huge durable goods bubble, or a goods bubble more generally, that has emerged over the last year and a half. Consumer spending on goods now 25% higher than what it was back in February of 2020. 25% higher. So think about everything we're reading on the news with respect especially to supply chain issues. Is it any wonder that we're having supply chain challenges given that the market for consumer goods is 25% up from where it was in February of 2020? This is demand that companies are having to scale up in order to realize, and that's not something that can necessarily be done overnight when you see a 25% increase in demand. So a consumer goods bubble that is most definitely emerged. On the flip side, we see the services market, which of course has been down as people have been social distancing, but we see significant recovery throughout 2021. So even in this sector of the economy, leisure and hospitality, the service sector more generally, we've seen very sizable growth and recovery in 2021 as people have been going back out to eat. They've been going to restaurants. They've been traveling more. We've seen a very good year for tourism in South Carolina specifically. A lot of recovery here in this area. So this market is still strong, even though it is not yet fully recovered. So we have the goods market and we have the services market. And so looking forward then to 2022, again, the question is this sustainable? Is this sustainable? And what does the consumer goods market look like going forward? Because that's going to be important when you're dealing with individual businesses. Who are their customers? Are they in these markets? And can they expect this level of demand to persist going forward? And one way to think about this, to consider how the consumer goods market is likely to evolve into 2022, is to consider the effects that are resulting from two sources, what we'll call the income effect and the substitution effect, particularly when we think about consumer goods. So the income effect is the increase in consumer goods demand that we've observed simply because of the stimulus dollars that we just talked about. So the additional disposable income, the additional savings rates that have occurred, that has made consumers more flush with cash in the last year, and they've been spending more on consumer goods. So a very straightforward argument, the income effect. More income leads to more demand. But we also have, on the other hand, we have the substitution effect. And this is the additional demand in the goods market that has come about because of the need to social distance. And as in the last year, people have moved from spending on services and instead been spending on goods, right? So we can think about a typical family that instead of traveling on vacation, they put additional money into remodeling their home, let's say, or buying a new car or buying a new dishwasher. So they're spending more on goods in lieu of spending on services. So both the income effect and the substitution effect are happening at the same time. And as we look towards 2022 and we think about this elevated level of activity, especially in the goods market and the extent to which it may come back down, it's important to understand what impact the income effect and the substitution effect each are having and how important each one is. What's the weight of each effect? And it turns out that we can do an approximation of this and actually go in, look at the data, and do the calculations to get a sense of what the relative importance is. And we've done that here. So what we essentially do is to say, okay, let's look at the consumer goods, the level of consumer goods spending above trend, right, that 25% above trend, and then let's just take dollar for dollar and pull it away. So let's take $1 out of consumer spending on goods and move it over to the services category, right? And let's keep doing that dollar for dollar until we completely restore the service sector back to its overall trend level. So what we're doing there, when we do that math, is we're actually it's an approximation of undoing the substitution effect, right? Because we're moving those dollars that, quote unquote, should have been in the service sector and moving them back. And so what's left then, anything that is left, could be thought about as a first approximation for the income effect. So we actually do this exercise, and what we find, as you see here, is that the income effect, it turns out, represents roughly 2/3, about 68% of the consumer goods bubble that we're currently seeing in the United States. That means that about 1/3 is coming from the substitution effect. So what does that tell us going into 2022? It tells us that we're likely to see this 68% continue to come back down because disposable income levels are coming back down and those savings rates are coming back down as those dollars are spent in the U.S. economy. So we may see a significant pullback in that demand in the consumer goods bubble of up to about 2/3. However, that leaves another third that's still out there due to the substitution effect. And that's the million-dollar question. That's really the wild card. How quickly do we see a resumption of pre-pandemic norms in terms of spending, in terms of the distribution between spending on goods and spending on services? Because even if all of that income effect were to fade away, we're still talking about a consumer goods bubble that would persist through 2022 and into 2023. So that's what we have to really be on the lookout for. How quickly do we see this income effect dissipate? And to what extent do we see the substitution effect dissipate as well? Because there's no guarantee that it necessarily will do so in 2022. In fact, there are actually some that are speculating that this new ratio between the spending on goods and services in the national economy may be permanent. I think that's a bit of a stretch because in order to make that argument, you would have to essentially suggest that there's going to be a major reshuffling of how consumers are purchasing that is a significant deviation from what we've seen over the last 50 plus years. This graph, for example, illustrates, as you see here, goods as a percentage of total U.S. consumer spending going back to 1980. You see a similar trend if we could track it back even further, or if we did track it back further. But basically, we're becoming more of a service-oriented economy. A greater percentage of the items that we spend in the United States is within the service sector. And that's normal for any advanced economy. We typically see that. So slowly over time, the percentage of consumer spending that goes towards goods tends to go down. But we noticed beginning in 2020 a major deviation, right? So a bit of an uptick compared to what we've seen before, and certainly an aberration based on historical trends over going back to 1980. But if you were to suggest that this is the new normal, what you're saying is that this is not a blip, but this is a permanent shift. And while that's certainly possible, I think that it's more likely that this is to be a blip, and when we look back 5 or 10 years from now, we will see a trend very similar to what we're seeing here. In other words, we're becoming more of a service economy. So this may take time. We may not see a reversion within the next year. It may be into 2023 or even 2024. But if you're going to make the argument that this is a permanent shift, you're basically fighting against this long-run trend that has been with us in the United States. So the income effect, more short-lived, will dissipate considerably in 2022. The substitution effect may be more long-lived, especially if we continue to see fluctuations in the number of COVID cases and new variants as we move forward. Because, of course, as we see more COVID cases, that can potentially mute some of the change or the substitution back from goods and back towards services as it interferes with travel and leisure and hospitality and so forth. All right, so that looks at the demand side as well as the supply side of South Carolina's economy and to a large extent to what's going on for the U.S. as a whole. as we look out towards 2022. Again, a pretty optimistic picture about where we're headed in South Carolina going forward in terms of our overall outlook. But we, of course, have some major headwinds that we have heard about, alluded to already, and I want to talk a little bit more about both of these. The biggest short-run threat in South Carolina that we have to consider in 2022, inflation and persistently high inflation. It's already having real impacts for South Carolinians that I want to talk specifically about and quantify. And then secondly, we need to consider further South Carolina's biggest long-run threat, which is basically the ongoing labor shortages that we're seeing. And as I'm going to mention, this is a threat certainly in 2022, but it's likely to be a threat to South Carolina for the foreseeable future, and is really a challenge that we have to address proactively because businesses are likely to struggle to find workers for the foreseeable future, not only because of the period of high demand that we're in now, but because of longer-term demographic changes that we'll talk about. So first, let's talk specifically about inflation and what the implications are for South Carolina. So here we can see the overall U.S. inflation measures, so 6.2%. Again, that's the number that, the latest number that we have for U.S. inflation rate. You can see here, that compares to about 4.6% core inflation, which is one of the measures that the Federal Reserve likes to use because by core inflation, we just mean all goods and services, but throwing out food and energy prices. So 6.2% versus 4.6%. But regardless of how you define it, inflation very clearly higher than anything we've seen in recent years. Ambassador Mulvaney talked about that. But certainly we can see over the last decade here, inflation significantly elevated. So very, very much an aberration compared to what we've seen in the last decade. And so the ultimate question then is why? What's going on? What's driving it? What can we think about it, especially in South Carolina? And one of the big causes, particularly what we're seeing here, is a mismatch of supply and demand. And this is a piece of the puzzle that sometimes gets lost, that a good chunk of the cause of this inflation is simply this elevated demand that we're seeing in the state and national economy right now. And we can really put a fine point on this if we come back and reference the same data that we already talked about and just compare the differences here between basic supply and basic demand. So if we look at overall consumer spending right now, so looking at goods and services, right? So we look at the whole picture. Where are we today compared to February of 2020? And it turns out that the cumulative growth in consumer spending at the U.S. level is up about 10.2%. Compare that to where we are on the supply side in terms of employment, which is close to recovery and will likely recover in South Carolina in 2022, but still down about 1.8% as we talked about. And for the U.S., down about close to 3%, about 2.8%. So just consider that difference between supply and demand. If our demand for consumer spending is up 10% and our employment levels are down between, let's say, 2 and 3%, that's a huge delta, right? That's a major, major difference between supply and demand. So it's no surprise that we're going to see some shortages. It's no surprise that we're going to see some increase in price level because demand is so outpacing supply right now. And so just think about it from an individual business's standpoint, right? So let's say that you're producing a certain level of output and you're going along at 100% capacity in 2019. All of a sudden, your capacity is cut by this amount shown in gray here during the pandemic. And now you're facing additional demand. Not only are you facing the demand you saw before, so that gray part of your demand has been restored, but also you have this new level of demand in green. And so what a lot of employers are facing now is the fact that they're saying, okay, well, not only do I need the employees back that I lost, yeah, that's really important. I've got to get those guys back. But I also need new employees to facilitate this additional demand now that I wasn't seeing before. So it's an additional level of demand that employers weren't facing that they now have to deal with, which is why, even though we're getting back to pre-COVID levels of employment, that's not going to be sufficient to address this labor shortage because demand is so much higher than it was previously. And that's going to continue to be true even if we do see some pullback in that income effect, because remember, demand is continuing to grow as our economy is continuing to grow. So this mismatch is a major causal factor to a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in 2021 and in 2022 as well. And of course, inflation is having very practical implications for South Carolina as well. And we can see this because in certain sectors, we see very sizable wage gains over the last 2 years. So we can just compare the inflation rate, as you see here, to what the actual wage growth has been in different sectors. But that hasn't been true for everybody. And so what we find on average is that even though certain sectors have seen very strong wage growth because of high demand over the last several years, so you can see several sectors. So for example, leisure and hospitality there up close to 15% in terms of wage gains since 2019. So there are a number of sectors that have done very well, and workers have seen sizable wage gains. That isn't true for everybody, and when we estimate it across the board, it turns out that about 40%, as you can see here, of the state's workforce, we estimate to have seen a loss in purchasing power since 2019 due to inflation. So even if we add up all of these wage gains, all the workers that have experienced these wage gains, it still only represents about 60% of the workforce when we look at wage gains in excess of the current levels of inflation that have occurred over the last year or so. So a sizable percentage of South Carolina's workforce is being affected and has already been affected by this high rate of inflation. And this is going to continue into 2022 as long as inflation remains elevated. So there are very practical consequences for South Carolinians that we're already seeing. And of course, the other practical consequence that we have to think about in South Carolina is that this high inflation may necessitate next year an increase in interest rates. And Dr. Woodward's going to come back and talk about this, so I'm not going to talk specifically about Fed policy. But just to mention that raising interest rates does on the margin affect recovery momentum, or at least can affect recovery momentum. So we have to be watching the Fed very carefully and seeing how the economic recovery interacts with increased interest rates, because that can affect the momentum in different sectors of the recovery going forward. So very practical implications for what's happening on the ground in South Carolina. And then secondly, if we think more long-term, what do we need to be thinking about for South Carolina? What do we need to be considering? And it really comes down to this labor shortage as an ongoing challenge that South Carolina is going to have to proactively address. Now, why is that the case? Why do we think that this is more of a long-term challenge as opposed to a potentially short-term challenge as inflation may turn out to be? Is this really the new normal for South Carolina? And I would suggest to you that the answer to that question is yes. And we can see this in a number of different ways. So first of all, where can we see evidence for the labor shortage? Now, obviously, we see help wanted signs all over the place. That's, the help wanted sign in a sense is the sign of the times in a very literal sense. So we all know that this labor shortage exists. We see it broadly across all industry sectors, but we can track it as well looking at the job openings rate, and just look at the difference here in today's job openings rate compared to where it was the last time our economy was in a similar position. So if we just look at the last time our unemployment rate in South Carolina was at 3.9%, which is where it is today, look at how much lower the job openings rate was. Right? So a very different picture of the labor market today, again, compared to where we were before the pandemic recession, and a very different labor market today compared to where we were previously. So very clear evidence here of the labor shortage. We can see it in our everyday lives. We see it very clearly in the data. The job openings rate, one of the most obvious points of comparison where we can see what's going on and how different today's economy has been from previous expansions in terms of where we are. And so this has led to this concept that has been deemed the Great Resignation. You may have heard this term bandied about a lot, the Great Resignation, the fact that more and more individuals are actually quitting their jobs and they're looking for better opportunities. But we have to remember the Great Resignation is actually the result of the labor shortage. It's not causing it. I am actually not a big fan of the Great Resignation. I like the term the Great Churn maybe a little bit better, because resignation sometimes implies, resigning and leaving the labor force, right? But that's really not what's happening here. It's the resignation of one position to seek out a better opportunity. So the great churn or the great resignation has been a clear result of this labor shortage, and we're seeing more and more individuals quit their jobs because they're finding better opportunities. This is most definitely a workers' market, the best job market by far that we've seen in a generation. So it's great news for workers as they look for more opportunities, look for higher wages, look for more flexibility. And so this great resignation is the example of that and where we can actually see it in the data. And so what does that mean for South Carolina? Because it really does pose a bit of a puzzle, because as we talked about before, if the labor force is higher than it was before the pandemic, and we see, or before the pandemic began, and we see employment that is getting back to pre-pandemic levels, then we see this high level of demand that is generating this ongoing labor shortage. And in the Southeast, once again, as we saw before, South Carolina is one of the few states that has seen this gain in its labor force. And so the reason, as I mentioned before, as I alluded to, as to why this is the case is because of the population gains that South Carolina has been seeing relative to the rest of the country. South Carolina, one of 11 states that has seen an increase in its labor force. But it turns out that when we look at these population gains, something interesting emerges. So first of all, as a whole, population gains in South Carolina has actually been better than almost any other state. So labor force overall we're one of 11 states that has seen an increase in the labor force. But in population itself, South Carolina actually ranks third in terms of its net migration ranking over the last decade, and number 2 in terms of population increases over the last year. So South Carolina, again, relative to other states, has been seeing significant population growth and in-migration. But here's the key point here when we look at these changes. We're seeing an increasing worker deficit that's actually making the existing labor shortage worse. Because when we look at the numbers, a majority of the people moving into South Carolina are over the age of 55. A majority of the population's over the age of 55. So you can think about it just very intuitively. For every 3 people that are moving into the state, what does that mean? Well, all 3 people are going to be consumers, but only one of them is likely to be in the labor market, at least for an extended period of time. Obviously, people over 55 are working, but they don't necessarily have as long of a projection to work as someone who is in the prime working years of 25 to 54. So that's a ratio that, if it continues, is going to continue to exacerbate this deficit or this discrepancy between labor supply and demand, to a large extent labor demand, that we're seeing already. So that's why we have to be very proactive in South Carolina about addressing this worker shortage, because the demographics suggest and the immigration trends suggest that this is going to be around for the foreseeable future. This is not purely a COVID-related problem that's going to go away over the next year. And then the other way that we can see this, not just looking at immigration, but also just general changes in the generational in demographics in terms of the generations. So you can see here, we can just look at the differences in terms of the percentage of the population that has evolved over time as we've moved forward in time from 1994 to 2017. And you can see how more and more baby boomers are exiting the labor force, and millennials and Gen Z are taking over. And that's normal. That's what we would expect. But the challenge here is that millennials and Gen Z are each smaller than the baby boomers in terms of the absolute number. And so as the baby boomers are slowly replaced by Gen Z and by millennials, since they're a smaller population group, what that means is that the labor force participation rate actually has to be higher among the younger generation to fully replace all of the exiting workers in the baby boomer generation. And so again, it's a simple math problem. When you do the calculations on that, what we find is that the labor force participation rate may need to be as high as in the 80s for the younger generation in order to completely replace the workers that are exiting in the baby boomer generation. So I don't know how closely you were paying attention before when we were looking at the labor force participation rates in South Carolina, but it's not close to 80%. It's in the upper 50s. It's around 57% for South Carolina right now. And depending on how you define it, depending on the group that we look at, whether we're looking at all individuals or just the prime working age, so there are different definitions of labor force participation. But generally, it hovers in either the upper 50s or the low 60s. Again, nothing close to the 80s. So again, that is a wide gap, and it illustrates that this is going to be a more long-term challenge for South Carolina, and we have to be very proactive about recruiting younger people and keeping our existing talent within South Carolina, because if we don't take proactive steps here, we're going to see this increasing worker deficit over time. And that's, again, great news if you're a worker, if you're a job seeker, but it becomes increasingly challenging if you are an employer. So, wrapping up, for 2022, we are very optimistic for our recovery next year in South Carolina. We're getting back to a pre-COVID level of activity, more compatible with the great expansion that we saw over the previous decade. So we really do see being able to push play on that great expansion again in 2022, barring any surprises from new COVID variants, of course, that being the major wild card. But South Carolina's economy firing on all cylinders. We're seeing a very strong recovery, and again, very optimistic for our growth in 2022. I suggest that we continue to monitor very closely the income and substitution effects. If you're looking for leading indicators, particularly with respect to how consumer spending may taper off in 2022 and how that may affect the goods and the services markets and the businesses that you all are interacting with, these income and substitution effects are going to be key to watch in terms of their impacts on consumer spending going forward, a set of leading indicators to watch for. Inflation remains the biggest short-run concern for South Carolina. As we've seen, it's already eroding the purchasing power of about 40% of South Carolinians. That's likely to continue until we begin to see inflation taper back off. And of course, the long-run labor shortage is likely to be with us for the foreseeable future. So something that South Carolina continues to have to be very proactive about. And then finally, I just want to wrap up by talking about two other industry changes that are coming sooner rather than later. And these are other areas where South Carolina can focus and do very well in the coming decade if it successfully takes advantage of the evolution in these markets. So one is manufacturing, and the other is the logistics sector. So if we look at manufacturing and advanced manufacturing, that's been a major driver, of course, for our growth over the previous decade. We're seeing a lot of shifts in manufacturing now towards electric vehicles, and South Carolina has a real opportunity to be on the forefront of this change and to continue to, and this industry can continue to drive growth for South Carolina in the next decade the way it has in the previous decade. And then the second industry sector to look to is logistics. Because we are seeing these population gains, again, that does reflect a challenge for labor force needs. There's no question about that. But it also represents a real opportunity for industry. Because if the southeastern United States is likely to be the biggest generator of population gains over the next 2 decades, and that is the consensus among virtually every projection for population changes that you'll see. And South Carolina, as a result, then, will be right in the heart of that, which means that businesses are going to be looking to set up shop in South Carolina and in the Southeast to be able to deliver those consumer goods to individuals. So think about more announcements coming in from distribution centers like Amazon and Walmart and others. That industry, logistics, transportation, distribution, and logistics, is going to be booming in the Southeast. And because of this additional consumer demand due to population gains, and South Carolina has the opportunity to really take advantage of that going forward. So 2 industry sectors that give us every reason to be very bullish for South Carolina's growth over the next decade. So we do face some challenges with respect to the labor shortage. There's no question about that. But some strong opportunities for South Carolina going forward, both into 2022 and for the next decade. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention, and we're going to hold off on Q&A until the end of the program this afternoon. And with that, I'm going to introduce my colleague, our Division Director, Dr. Doug Woodward, and he's going to make his comments now, talking about more about monetary policy.
Okay, thank you, Joey. As you can see, we're very optimistic. Who would have thought a year and a half ago when all this started with COVID that we would have essentially what is a V-shaped recovery. We're at full employment. We're back to where we were in 2019. We're worried about labor shortages. So I want to talk about how did this all come about? Why are we in such great shape here in South Carolina in particular, but also, across the United States? The United States economy turns out to be very resilient. In my remarks, I want to pull together some of the comments that were made by Mick Mulvaney at the beginning and then build on Joey's outlook for 2022 in South Carolina. The theme here is what's the next phase? Where are we headed next in 2022? But first I want to talk about what I see happening within Washington, which I call pandemomics, I guess is, I just made that word up. So I have to learn how to pronounce it. The pandemic economic theory that is quite different than what we had before COVID broke out a year and a half ago. There's a consensus, really, about how to approach economic policy these days that we didn't have before the pandemic. And this is where I depart a little bit from Ambassador Mulvaney. He was talking about how there's more division, there's more partisanship, and in a lot of ways that's true, more polarization. We read about that all the time. But what's really incredible is that there's been this consensus about economic policy during the pandemic, and I want to address that. Mostly that has to do with the need for this unprecedented stimulus coming out of Washington. And that's largely the reason there's been so much stimulus, that consumer spending is doing so well, the economy is recovering. We've never had this kind of stimulus, anything close to this, at least not since the Great Depression. And there seems to be a consensus around that. I want to talk about that seems to be bipartisan. I'm going to also talk about jobs, just as Joey was talking about in South Carolina. But I also want to talk about wealth and assets. We talk about GDP, we talk about, that's our measure of the economy, but something's happened to wealth in this country, the likes of which we've never seen before. Maybe some of you are benefiting from that. We're really moving into a situation where the people who own wealth, they're the haves, and the people who don't own wealth, the haves-nots. I want to address that. That's one of the things that's come out as a result of this unbelievable amount of stimulus. And I'm going to focus mostly on the stimulus, not from the Congress passing spending bills that Mick Mulvaney was talking about and then signed by the President. I want to talk mostly about Fed policy because this has been very unusual and there's a lot of agreement about what the Fed is doing. But in 2022, Fed policy is going to shift. We're going to hear that next week. There's going to be a big announcement. All this stimulus coming from the Federal Reserve is going to be tapering. We're going to see rising interest rates. So we're in a new environment in 2022. I want to address how that may affect asset prices, and that includes stocks, crypto, and also something many of us have seen happen in terms of appreciation of assets is housing. So I'm going to address that. Also in the context of those who don't own assets, which is creating a huge amount of wealth inequality. Wait till you see the figures on this if you haven't already. So I want to address all of this and then talk about the implications for South Carolina's economic outlook going into 2022. So let me start with the consensus that I see in Washington, and it's bipartisan. We need more money. That's what everyone thought was the key, sort of it's like the oxygen to get us resuscitate the economy after we shut it down in March and April in 2020. Everybody agreed we needed an expansionary monetary policy to get us out of this potential depression, which everyone was worried about just a couple of years ago, as you might remember. And the key to getting us out was put us on this life support. And we've been on life support with more money ever since that time, since March 2020. And now it's about to shift. We're going to turn off the oxygen and see if the patient can live without it. That's what's going to happen in 2022. So who's responsible for all of this? This is what I want to talk about. You know, y'all know The Wizard of Oz, of course, the story. That was actually an allegory about money. That was a story that was written, a novel, actually, before the movie was made in the 40s. It was at the turn of the century by Frank Baum, wrote an allegory about central banks and the need for a central bank and the need for more money. So what I want to do is now say, pay attention to that man behind the curtain, because this is the reason we're seeing this very, very vigorous and very strong recovery, the likes of which we never have seen before. We've seen this picture before. And here's a good example of what I mean by being bipartisan. Here's Jerome Powell. We've seen him already. We've been discussing him. Just reappointed to be the chair of the Federal Reserve. He was originally appointed under Trump and was just reappointed under Biden with virtually no opposition. Everybody agreed that what he was doing must have been right. I'm using him as the face of our monetary policy because he's the chair of the Federal Reserve, our central bank. But of course, there's a whole, it's actually an independent government institution that's supposed to be, when I say independent of the Congress and of the president. Ambassador Mulvaney was suggesting it's getting more political. I actually don't really see that. I see it as very, very bipartisan, and mostly people have just said, you do whatever it takes. And that's exactly what Jerome Powell is quoted as saying he wanted to do. I'll do whatever it takes to get the economy back moving again. That's what he said in March 2020. Their goal, their mandate for the Federal Reserve is twofold. Mick Mulvaney alluded to that. It's to lower unemployment, to keep low unemployment, or try to reach a goal towards full employment. As Joey was just talking about, we're there already at full employment. So we met that goal. So the question then has to do with, why do we need to pump more money, or we call it liquidity, into the economy? Well, Powell was saying, we'll keep doing this even if it's inflationary. But now they're starting to shift. We'll see coming into 2022. So here's what we had before COVID. We used to have a debate about whether we needed this amount of monetary stimulus, this amount of money pumped into the economy. We had doves on the one side, and they were for easy money, more money, low interest rates. And then there were hawks that said we had to raise interest rates. Even just before the pandemic, there was still a debate about that. There is in academia, there is in Washington, a debate about what is the appropriate amount of monetary stimulus that's necessary to reach our goals of full employment. So we used to have a debate back and forth because the hawks were always concerned about inflation, and the doves wanted to stimulate the economy and create jobs. Now, after COVID, where are the hawks? You don't hear about them anymore. They're gone. We just have doves. And they're on both sides. You know, if there are two sides, if you want to think of it that way. Democrats are dovish, Republicans are dovish. They want easy money. They want to keep this going. So this is the consensus I'm talking about that we have. That I don't think people have really realized we didn't have that before. There was actually a debate. There's very little debate. That's why Jerome Powell, who's been very dovish, was reappointed by Biden. So how does this work? This magic monetary policy that we have, which we've had the Federal Reserve since 1913. We didn't always create money this way. In the 19th century, we didn't have a Federal Reserve. But since we've had the Federal Reserve, it's gone through an evolution. It's been very pragmatic. It's changed over the time. But to stimulate the economy, to expand the money supply, to stimulate growth, Mick Mulvaney was talking about one of the tools that they use with reserve requirements, but the main tool that they use is open market operations. That's what they're meeting about next week to talk about, open market operations, and that is run by the New York Federal Reserve, buying and selling treasury bills, short-term treasury bills, to manipulate interest rates. When they buy more treasury bills out of the central bank, that sends interest rates down, lower, and that's their goal, and they keep doing that until they reach their target interest rate. They use what's called the Fed funds rate as their target. That's one of their so-called tools. And by the way, they call these tools, but these are very imprecise. They don't know exactly how much they need to do in terms of buying these treasury bills, how that's exactly going to influence employment, for example. There's no, I'm an economist and I'll be honest with you, there is no economic model out there that tells you exactly how many jobs are going to be created when they engage in these open market operations. It's sort of like, let's do it and then let's see what happens in the markets. And they're constantly monitoring that using the data that they have available to them. And there's different measures of employment and unemployment. So it's very imprecise. The other thing that's happened recently in a big way is this quantitative easing. You all familiar with quantitative easing and QE? I talk to my students all the time, and I expect they're reading the Wall Street Journal and they're reading the financial press. And I said, you know what QE is? And they're like, no. They don't even, how could you not know? This is the biggest policy out there that's really changing our lives. This is what's creating most of the money recently, not just the open market operations, but this QE, this quantitative easing, which is large-scale purchases of assets, which we've been doing just in an unprecedented fashion. They do that, the way they pay for it, and this is where the magic comes in, you all know this? They can do something that nobody else can do, the central bank. They can just create new assets, new money out of thin air, just on the computer. We call it printing money, but that's an anachronism. We don't print so much money anymore. They do this by opening up reserves when a bank sells treasury bills to or treasury bonds to the Federal Reserve. They can just open up a reserve account, a deposit for them in their account, which they then can use to lend out or spend. But they're creating something new here because they can do that. They can just say you have more reserves. So that's really how they don't print money. I guess one way of thinking about it is they print reserves that can then be used to expand the economy. Those are their tools. These tools are very imprecise. Well, here's how it worked out. This is using the open market operations, and you can see here, there's again what I call the COVID consensus. Everybody wanted low rates. As we were getting into a very almost overheated economy just before COVID hit, and this is 2019, they started very, very slowly, in a very tepid way, raising the Fed funds rate, raising interest rates. And then the markets, which they're very concerned about these days. Their goal is not to be concerned about the stock market, it's about employment, the Federal Reserve, but they seem to be very concerned about rattling markets these days. The last time they tried raising rates, I'm telling you, they're going to start doing it next year. The markets reacted, in a very negative way. It was called the temper tantrum, or the taper tantrum. I'm sorry, and it's because they were going to taper their purchases of assets using the QE. The question is, how far are they going to go with raising rates next year? They're talking about, they call it 25 basis points. 0.25% increase in interest rates, and then it affects all interest rates. That's nothing. I mean, this is not what they used to do. Look at the chart. I mean, they used to be all over the place raising rates, especially if they were concerned about inflation. They're barely talking about that right now. It's going to change. We're going to see rates go up next year, but probably only, 0.5, 50 basis points. This is what the discussion is. They might accelerate that now up into February. We'll see how the markets react to that. All right, then there's QE, the quantitative easing. I just wanted to show you this because this is what has been stimulating the economy, hyper-stimulating the economy, as you can see on the right side. We've never had anything like this before in history. This is why we're bouncing back so quickly, especially as a result of monetary policy. As you can see on the right arrow there, the thin line there indicates the short recession that we had. Look at the Great Recession, which is the thicker line. This is when they started this quantitative easing, this large-scale purchasing of assets and opening up new reserves and essentially expanding the money supply. It was not anywhere near what they've done recently. As soon as COVID hit, it's to the tune of $5 trillion of new money, and the whole economy is roughly $22 trillion. So that's a lot of money to be shoveling into the economy, the likes of which we've never seen before. Now we're going to start tapering this off. We're going to be in for an interesting ride here. The question came up in the comments before about the velocity of money. Well, this shows you what's been happening to money. The velocity of money is really a relationship between how much money we have relative to our gross domestic product, the size of goods and services, the amount of goods and services produced every year. And you see this, look on the right side here, there's way more money relative to GDP than we even need than we ever had before. We didn't do this anywhere near this extent in the Great Recession. It actually, the size of, the amount of money relative to the size of the economy, GDP, was pretty steady over time. But not recently. Now we've got a lot of money sloshing around there that doesn't seem to be needed to help stimulate goods and services. But the idea is that it does. We need more money. This is the consensus. More money equals more jobs. So let's just keep that monetary spigot going. So it's all about jobs, jobs, and to some extent that's worked. There's other reasons why the job market's recovered. It's not just because of the expansion of the money supply, but we have had a recovery. We're close to full employment. The lowest jobless claims across the U.S. In 50 years. So they've already reached whatever goal they have. Like I say, it's imprecise, but if they look at anything these days, the labor market is too tight right now. So why do we need more money in the economy? We don't. And we should be worried a little bit, as Ambassador Mulvaney and many others are starting to be concerned, that this is going to just fuel inflation. Too much money chasing the same amount of goods and services, the GDP. So there's been, as we've already shown you, 5–6% increase in inflation on goods and services, the highest in 40 years. It's in energy, although that's abating right now. Car prices, we all know about that. Rents, things that really matter to people. Prices are going up, and if your wages aren't going up as fast, your real standard of living is going down. And you're going to be on the have-not side of the ledger. That's been stimulating consumer demand, and now we've got these supply chain bottlenecks. There's no more reason for this kind of pumping liquidity into the economy. But here's what I really want to emphasize that I don't hear talked about enough, and that is all this money is fueling inflation, but not so much in goods and services. That's starting to happen. It's in assets. Assets are not part of GDP. Assets, and I'm talking about equities, the stock market. Now we've got crypto. Now, and the value of your house. That's not included in GDP, but that's where the price increases have been. All right, it's been, and we've seen incredible asset inflation over the last 2 years in the context of a pandemic. People are getting wealthier. When you say wealth, we're talking about their assets are appreciating. It's not a result of the, Elon Musk didn't get rich by, what is he worth, 200? It's changing all the time because the stock market, but 200 would say $1 billion. Do you think he worked that all for that? No, it's just his assets appreciated that much. And so he's benefiting from this equity market boom that we've seen, which is really surprising, but not surprising when you think about what the Federal Reserve has been doing, because all this money is being pumped into assets, not into production of goods and services. And if that's not enough, we came up with something new called crypto, and it's going into that. That's not part of GDP. It's not creating jobs, and it's going into the value of housing. So we're in the roaring 20s from an asset point of view, from a wealth point of view. You can see, everyone knows, I don't have to show you what's happening to the stock market. It's getting a little jittery right now. Why? Because they're going to wean us off the oxygen. Now the economy is going to have to live on its own, and as that happens, that's going to affect the equity markets. So my prediction for next year, you're not going to see anywhere near the kind of appreciation or inflation of assets and stocks that you've seen over the last couple of years, unless the Federal Reserve decides to keep doing what they've been doing, which they're probably not. And then there's this thing called crypto, Bitcoin and everything. We came up with something that didn't exist before, and because stock prices, valuations are way above historic, where they would be historically relative to the corporation's earnings. So we've got a bubble there. We've also seen that happen in crypto, where people need to park this money and try to make money, and they're speculating. A lot of people, some of this is just people trying to earn passive income now rather than to have to work. I even know students that do this. They think this is the way to get rich now, not by working hard, but either through Robinhood, which is they're on their phone all the time trading stocks, or trading crypto. Why work when you can make, and over the last couple of years, that's been the message they've been getting. This is how you get rich. Not by actually producing goods and services, but by investing in intangible things that have no, or at least direct connection to the expansion of our economy. The other major asset and many people have benefited from this. If you own houses, housing appreciation, like the likes of which we've never seen before. So that's where the money has been going in. That's why housing prices are going up. That's the main source of wealth for most people. If you own houses, you have benefited tremendously by this Federal Reserve policy, but it's been very uneven across different metro areas across the country. Some, it's just been incredible, some less so, but pretty much everywhere we've seen housing price appreciation across the United States. If you don't own homes, you're the have-nots. You don't own assets. You're not benefiting from this Federal Reserve policy. They don't talk about that. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. It's causing a lot of inequality. So the demographics and the segments of our population that don't own their own home are not benefiting at all from this hyper-stimulated economy. So we're seeing this housing price appreciation. Joey was talking about supply and demand. This is what we teach our students, and I won't test you on this, but there's a supply and demand. You can apply supply and demand to anything. You can apply it to the labor market, you can apply it to housing, but basically supply and demand is a relationship on the vertical axis between prices and quantity on the horizontal axis. And supply goes up, builders build more. When prices go up, that's why we have an upward sloping supply curve. And people demand more, in this case housing, quantity of housing, when prices go down. So we have a downward sloping demand curve. And as you can see, we've had this big shift in the demand for housing because of COVID. People are moving, people are demanding, want more space. Some people moving across metro areas. Most people stay within their own metro area, but wanted a different house because of work from home. And they just saw this opportunity now because of this hyper-stimulated economy to be able to buy houses. So we've had high demand, historically low mortgage rates, and this need for more space, work from home, and low supply. We're not producing anywhere near the amount of supply relative to demand, so prices are going up. And people are benefiting from that housing price appreciation. That's wealth creation. Here's what's happening in South Carolina. It's very uneven how this has played out. And this is, I want to emphasize again, as a result of Federal Reserve policy. I put together figures here for South Carolina metro areas, both in 2019 to start just before the pandemic through 2021, this is through the second quarter, and then long-term growth in appreciation of houses for South Carolina metros. This tells you a lot about how our different metro areas are doing. Who's really benefited from this wealth appreciation in housing? Well, anybody from Charleston? Okay, well, you should be happy, right? I mean, look at the difference, especially long-term growth. Not short-term, but long-term, 76% long-term growth and average appreciation of homes in Charleston. Then look at Columbia. Anybody here from Columbia? Our economy not growing is fast, not as much demand for housing, and we haven't benefited as much from this appreciation of housing. So it's very uneven across the country. Of course, the places in the West Coast that are just booming, people are just becoming very wealthy. And this all goes back to the Federal Reserve. It has very little to do with creating jobs, but it does create a lot of wealth for people who own assets. So who benefits from all this wealth appreciation? Look what happened since the Great Recession. Since the Great Recession, yes, but also since the COVID recession, which is very short-lived. On the right side, you can see that bar there. See where the pandemic hit, and then we see the increase in wealth for the top 1% relative to the bottom 50%. And you can see, so most of this benefit has gone to the rich. They've benefited by far the most from this wealth appreciation. It was true before, but it's getting even more true now. Is this the Federal Reserve's policy? I don't think they even talk about it. They don't think about it, but this is the consequence of what they're doing. They're creating more wealth inequality. So the rich are getting richer. This just shows you the share of total wealth held by the 1%. That's in the blue line, and then the red is not the 90%, not the top, not 1%. And that's, as you can see in the red line, declines. So the relative share of the rich, just the 1%, has more wealth than the 90% of the rest of the population. And that's exacerbated during the latest period of monetary expansion. All right, so I just want to close by saying, where should this money go? I mean, it's going into bloating up assets. What we need and what would benefit South Carolina, and this is important for our outlook, is real productive investment. We want to see this money flow into creating opportunities for new jobs, plant and equipment investment. Fortunately, as you can see here, we are seeing an uptick recently in real productive investment. Now, this is what's going to make our economy stronger, give us the ability to produce more goods and services. And it's particularly good for South Carolina because when investment goes up, we benefit a lot. We get a lot of capital investment in our manufacturing sector and distribution, like Dr. Von Nessen was talking about. We need more investment in these sectors. That's what's going to hold the inflation down. We need more really productive investment to produce more goods and services. Rely less on China, for example. And fortunately, that is starting to happen. I am very hopeful that now we're going to start to see this money flow into real productive investment and away from just passive accumulation or appreciation of wealth in things like cryptocurrencies. So that would be good for South Carolina, and I'm pretty optimistic we're going to start to see an uptick in investment. It's going to be good for our state, and it's going to be good overall for jobs and for a broader base of the population. It's create a healthier economy. Another thing that I see very positive going forward, the one thing I think that finally there was a consensus about too, in addition to monetary policy, and that's improving our infrastructure. We have heard for years from the private sector employers. I'll give you an example. Michelin has talked about this for years, a big investor in South Carolina, that they can't expand if we don't improve the infrastructure. Well, it's going to happen. We finally got it passed. We've got over $1 trillion, I guess about only $5 to $6 billion will come into South Carolina to improve our infrastructure, but we need it. That's going to take some time. It's not going to be spent right away. It will be. The projects will start fairly soon, and we're in pretty good shape in South Carolina to identify where we need to make these infrastructure improvements. So we'll probably move as quick as any state in getting things done. We need this infrastructure improvement to be able to support the private sector investment, the real productive investment that we need. But that's just what we need, so that's another reason I'm optimistic going into 2022 as well as in the next few years as more and more infrastructure improvements are actually made in terms of roads and bridges, airports. As you can see, we'll have electric vehicle charging stations. That means more investment in EV production, which we'd like to see more come to South Carolina. Be improvements in broadband, especially in the rural areas, good for our state. We need to create a better broadband infrastructure to help our rural areas. Cybersecurity and drinking water quality, that's also in there as well. But the big one's going to be improving our roads and bridges. So this is good. This is really what we need. We need to move this money that's been parked in assets, move it into something that's going to actually improve in a tangible way the economy. So just finally, just to make one more comment, and that's, will this bubble burst as we see the Federal Reserve taper its asset purchases and start to raise interest rates? We've been through many panics, many recessions. I show you all since we've had the course of U.S. history. We had 12 recessions just in World War II. We had the long expansion after the global financial crisis in 2008 to 2009. Then we had this long expansion, longest in our U.S. history. We weren't even headed into recession before COVID. Then we had the COVID short-lived recession. I think as the Federal Reserve tapers, you're going to see some volatility in the markets. People might move out of crypto, but I don't think we're looking at any major panic here. I don't think we're going to see a stock market collapse like we've seen in previous panics throughout our history. It's just not going to happen. There's plenty of money out there. It's got to be parked somewhere, and it's not going to. If it were to move out of the stock market, if that bubble were to burst, where would it go? People are going to sell their houses. Where were they going to park the money? In crypto? I mean, it's going to still be there. We've created this $5 trillion of new money. It's going to still be out there parked. It's going to shift around a lot more now. That would be my prediction. And there won't be as much of it coming in. We're weaning our way off the life support. The oxygen is being cut back. We're going to have to breathe on our own. But the existing $5 trillion that's out there is still going to be out or around somewhere. So it's not going to crash. That would be at least my prediction at this point. We'll see. Okay, so South Carolina 2022, we're going to keep roaring. We're very optimistic. This is a new phase in the COVID economy because of the cutback in the Federal Reserve's asset purchases and money supply creation. I think asset price appreciation, that's going to start to slow down. We're still going to be in a tight job market. That's good. We're going to see wages and incomes, I think, and continue to improve because of that tight labor market, as Dr. Von Nessen was talking about. And I'm very hopeful that we're going to start to see real productive investment increase, much more than it had even during the last expansion, supported by these infrastructure improvements. So that's why I'm happy going into this Christmas season. It's been a remarkable ride over the last year, but here we are in really, really good shape. Thank you very much. And now, thank you. Dr. Von Nessen will come back and join me, and we'd love to entertain your questions about anything that we've talked about today, whether it's the South Carolina economy, the outlook for jobs, inflation. Anybody? Questions? Yes. Go ahead. Yeah, they're going to bring a mic to. Wait for the mic. Thank you.
The housing market I had a question on. We saw Charleston, the derivation between that and Columbia.
Right.
People coming to South Carolina, again, not designated as Charleston versus Columbia versus Greenville. The housing market in Columbia, South Carolina and the area, do you have a read on that, or is it more state specific? Thank you.
Joey, you want to? Yeah.
So, well, we've certainly seen, there we go. You can hear a little better. So looking at housing markets, they are regional. Charleston and Myrtle Beach and Hilton Head have been by far doing the best because they have seen most of the population growth. But as we saw, markets across the state have all done well. And going into 2022, I think that's likely to continue because we're continuing to see high demand because employment has come back. That's usually the best predictor that we have for housing demand. So when we look at growth long term, sales activity tends to be correlated with employment growth pretty strongly. So because when we look at employment gains across the state, and Columbia does have weaker job growth relative to the other major metropolitan regions, we expect to continue to see relatively slower housing growth in Columbia compared to the other regions, but still positive growth going forward. And again, growth expected for Columbia, but comparing Columbia to Charleston, Charleston is going to continue to drive the state in terms of just a comparative analysis there, because Charleston's where the population is, it's where we've seen most of the job growth, and that's probably going to continue into next year.
And there's more constraint on supply in Charleston. They are starting to build up I-26 towards Somerville, but not as much opportunity for building as we see in Lexington County, for example, here. So there's more opportunity on the supply side, which holds prices down.
But inventory is still a problem across the state too. Yeah, more so certainly there than anywhere else. But inventory levels have been low. They were low going into the pandemic, and that's just been exacerbated now. And that's certainly going to be the case for the foreseeable future.
Yep, thank you. Back here. Yes. Yeah.
Forthcoming period?
During the pandemic?
Oh, in your analysis, what role has productivity growth played in your projections?
Yes, well, that's a good question. That's always on the supply side, and we look at that nationally. We don't have any figures on South Carolina for productivity growth. That takes a few years to really come out with an accurate measure, but going into the pandemic, what we're seeing is productivity is still growing, but it was slowing down. And that's a puzzle to economists, is why that has been happening. It's been happening now actually for more than a couple decades. We had the last big burst in productivity growth was in the 1990s, the sort of mid-1990s. We had a big growth in productivity when the internet first started, and we had more computers, and everything was become digital. There was a big increase in productivity. But since that time, there hasn't been as much productivity growth, because think of the companies that are really doing so well right now. They're driving our economy. They're like Facebook. They don't create a lot of productivity. In fact, they might be a drag on productivity if you think about it. But that's where a lot of investment has gone. It's still slow, but it may be, it may be coming back a little bit with more automation, okay, more AI, artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, for example. That's going to drive higher productivity growth, especially for our state, because we are a manufacturing state. Okay, there's another question right here. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
When you guys look at the fact that South Carolina was able to rebound so quickly, was it due to a lot of our industries being deemed essential, or what were some of the contributing factors there?
Yes, that's a great question. So there are two primary factors. One is policy-oriented, as you allude to. So we had a more targeted shutdown, more limited shutdown, because more industries were deemed essential, or more segments of the economy, and also because there was a more limited shutdown period. So businesses were able to reopen faster. And as you know, when the longer a business is shut down, the less likely it's going to be able to recover. So that was part of it. And the other part was just that we were fortunate in our industry mix in South Carolina. So manufacturing, for example, able to take advantage of this huge consumer goods bubble that we've seen. And we have a strong tourism industry in our state, but it's not as large of a percentage of our economy as, say, Florida or Nevada or others. So it's a combination of policy and just our industry composition.
Yeah, but I'll just add to that. But we're lucky. We actually make things in South Carolina, and durable goods, things that last. And that during the pandemic, that's a lot of what people wanted. We think we import everything from China, but as you know, that's not entirely true. Even just nearby, we make washing machines. Samsung has a big factory, and they expanded. And these are the kinds of things our people were purchasing during the pandemic. We made them, and that's part of the reason why we did relatively well.
Yeah, we've really been in the center of this on the supply and the demand side. So from a supply standpoint, manufacturing goods, and then from the demand standpoint, because we see so much more population growth in this region of the country and in South Carolina, so both sides of the equation, we're contributing. We're right in the center of it.
And that's why I'm bullish that we're going to continue to be. We're going to get this investment here, because manufacturers like it. They see they can produce in America and produce the goods and services that people want. They're already seeing the positive effects during the pandemic. Yeah. Go ahead. Over here. Sorry.
Thank you so much for this. My question is related to rural counties. We've talked a lot about Charleston, Hilton Head, we mentioned. How have rural counties recovered jobs, real estate, goods and services? Thank you.
Well, it's mixed. I wish Ambassador Mulvaney was here. He could tell you he lives in Lancaster County, which used to be considered rural even 20 years ago, especially the northern part now is now linked to the Charlotte metro area. So the rural counties that are the exurbs, or the close to a metropolitan area that hadn't developed before, have been doing extremely well, and that's true during the pandemic too. You can think in Charleston too, as you go up towards Somerville, you're starting to get into more rural areas. They're really starting to come into their own and develop, but they've got to be tied to a metro area. That's true in Greenville, Spartanburg, and it's even true to the Midlands to some extent. So there's the rural counties that are close in or in close to a major metro area doing fine. It's the ones that are not, that are lagging behind. That was true before the pandemic, continues to be the case right now. They need better infrastructure, they need education, but they've got low population, so it's a difficult challenge, especially those counties that are along I-95. We sometimes refer to as the corridor of shame. They're very much a challenge. That's been a challenge since I've been here. It's been the same thing, and it's been 35 years. The pandemic hasn't changed, made it any better, I'll say that. So they're still lagging. But some of our rural areas, though, are actually benefiting right now from the growth and the ability for people to work more remotely. They want bigger space. They want to move out in the rural, and they can do that now. So from that point of view, some rural areas are doing well.
Yeah, the only comment I would add to that is that in some of these areas that are not connected to a more urban area, they're not only just stagnating in terms of population, but we're seeing population declines in those counties. So people are moving out and moving to other regions of the state. So it's there's a population exodus in a lot of these.
And that just feeds
smaller
on
rural
itself,
counties.
as you can
Yeah.
imagine. Yeah. Yes, question here. Yeah, there you go.
I had a question about the discussion about the income effect and the substitution effect regarding inflation. How much of the income effect is due to governmental monetary policy and government subsidization of benefits, you know, the stimulus checks, et cetera, that we're receiving? And in combination with that, if those benefits are cut off or drastically tapered, would that then result in seeing a 2022 or a 2023 where there is demand contraction from consumers because of the loss of that income? And then how will then that affect prices? Should we expect prices to then recede back down as well and to actually have deflation? Or will we have a situation where price increases remain in place, the withdrawal of government subsidies to individuals contracts demand, and then we have, what, deflation?
Well, so a couple of ways to address that question. First of all, we already are seeing a bit of a pullback in that income effect. So that's already happening. And so the data that I showed on the disposable income and the savings rates show basically that bubble for both of those, where we see a huge spike in disposable income. That's come back down because of those payments, mainly from the stimulus checks more than anything else, but other factors as well. And then savings rates, which were elevated, now are back down, and so are being spent. So the short answer is yes, we do expect that pullback in spending, but I wouldn't say a contraction in consumer spending as much as a tapering and moving back to the long-run trend that we would normally expect, given that we're in a very strong employment position. So, which in a sense is really what we want, is we want want wages to basically take over and support consumer spending now that employment is coming back, and we're already beginning to see that. And part of the increased inflation that we saw last year was due to a spike in demand across sectors, but especially the service sector, and that's really what kicked off a lot of this increase in inflation. So for a period of time through really the early fall, a majority of the inflation that we were seeing was coming from basically items that were an outgrowth of the increase in demand in the service sector. So gasoline, used cars, airline prices, lodging prices. Those were really the big four that was driving that inflation early on. So yes, some of that is just from the spike in demand resulting from a movement back towards a normal economy. That should subside next year, but these longer term effects associated with the labor shortages, they're going to be counteracting one another next year.
I'll just quickly add to that. Consumer balance sheets right now are the best they've ever been. So consumers are in good shape to be spending, even as the direct stimulus payments, they're gone. I mean, that's already out there, that's spent. But there's a lot of pent-up demand still for a lot of things people can't even get. For example, automobiles, as you know. So this is going to continue for a while. And consumers are not heavily indebted, or at least their debt service payments aren't that high. So they can continue to spend on these goods and services for at least, I think, going into the next couple of years. Yeah. We'll continue. Yeah.
You painted quite a picture for the labor challenges we face. I'm concerned about the South Carolina labor because you can always hire it from outside and you get what you want. But for South Carolina, our K through 12 system, it's been the same old dinosaur since I was, since I went to school. And we got the same old 23 credits you got to take, and then boom, we put a stamp on you to get your high school. How do you have any pearls of wisdom to help advise or shape the K through 12 to produce the labor? Because only 24% of them are needed for, for college graduates anyway. So can we kind of prepare our own folks? You got any thoughts on that? And I know it's a bit scattered, but.
Well, Jim, I think you probably can answer that question better than I, because you're working with the high schools all the time. I know it's a challenge, and I think part of it is to get our high school to understand the labor force needs that we have right now. I know sometimes they take them out to show them different kinds of job opportunities, but the traditional thing is you need to get on college track if you want a good job. That's actually not the case anymore, and so we definitely do need to find a way to elevate the importance of non-college degree kinds of work and prepare people for that. We do it in our technical college system, but we need a better pipeline for that. Is there, maybe I'll throw this back to you. Is there anything you see going on in the high school, since you were talking to the... You're the experts. Well, we're not from the educational point of view. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Well, I think well, another idea is thinking about, and maybe this is already integrated into the curriculum, but work requirements for graduation just as an elective, well, not as an elective, but as a requirement, as an actual course, and that be the case for everyone, regardless of what your track is after high school, just to provide exposure to the industries that are in the state and to make students more aware of career opportunities here and just make that exposure mandatory. Whereas if it's the same curriculum as it's been for however long, as you're alluding to, many students are just not exposed to that reality until way later on.
It's a big challenge, though. I agree, yeah. And maybe we need to have economists working more with our education to help them understand the needs that we have in our state right now. Yes, Steve.
Doug, before we've got a question online.
Okay.
Somebody want to go ahead and ask this one. Is there any comment on end of defense spending in Afghanistan on the U.S. and the South Carolina economy?
Well, I don't think so. I think, the situation in Afghanistan happened very abruptly, but defense spending, military spending is up. Joey can talk about he's done an analysis of how important, how big defense spending is here in this state, but I don't think any of it was really too much related to deployments to Afghanistan. So, I mean, it's going to hold up. In fact, it's growing, the defense budget, despite what you hear about Afghanistan, just shifting into spending in other areas. Right?
Yeah, I would just say I agree with that. That it's expanding. We see that in the data, and we don't have specific numbers on it to be able to track specifically that impact from Afghanistan. But I don't think that's going to be a significant impact on the overall size of the military footprint in South Carolina. Certainly not long term.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Steve, go ahead. Yeah. Well, we'd have to talk to them. I think they're going to have to adjust to the reality. One thing, for example, BMW does, they have their BMW Scholars Program. So sometimes people come in with a high school degree, but they help them get a 2-year degree while they're interning or they're working with BMW. I think that's the kind of model we're going to have to see more. The businesses themselves are going to have to be involved in the education process because they know what their specific needs are. It's difficult for the schools to know that. But I think when we have these kinds of partnerships, and that's just one example, but I think it's a great, and it's been very successful, because BMW recognized this was 10 years ago, there was going to be a big challenge for them finding the kind of qualified workers they wanted if they're just expecting people to have 2-year or 4-year degrees. But they started working with the tech college system to get these college or high school grads into a 2-year program and work through an internship program with them. And to my knowledge, that's been very successful, and there's, like I said, other examples of that too.
Yeah, and they have more of an incentive to do that now than they ever have before, because that's one of the benefits of the labor shortage, is that it does provide more of an advantage to workers. Businesses they see what they need, they recognize they have to provide these resources to employees, and they're more willing to do that now than they may have been 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay. Well, it's 4 o'clock. I just want to say again, it's so great to be able to meet you and see you in person again. I hope we can continue to do this. This is where it's going to go. Thank you for those of you who are joining us online as well. And I wish you all a happy holiday and stay safe and prosperous. Thank you.